Gideon's Precious Penny, Walker Family Origin Cowboy Romance, Seven Sons Ranch in Three Rivers Romance, Book 8, written by Liz Isaacson, narrated by Terry Clark Linden, member SAG-AFTRA. Chapter 1. Gideon Walker left the farmhouse where he'd grown up and headed for the detached garage. "Come on, you lazy things," he said to the two dogs lying in the shade beneath the porch. "Let's go to the park." Matt got up, a goofy grin perpetually on his face. He was a big black animal with absolutely no sense whatsoever. But as he trotted alongside Gideon, a sweet sense of camaraderie moved through the man. He barked at something only he could see or smell, and Gideon ducked inside the garage to get their leashes. "Hey, Daddy," he said when he found his father inside, working on the riding lawn mower. His dad twisted the wrench, trying to get the bolt to move. It didn't. "Hey, son," he sighed and looked over to Gideon. The atmosphere changed, though Gideon tried to ignore it. He reached for the leashes, but both dogs had wandered off, probably in search of a squirrel or prairie dog. Mac especially had the attention span of a gnat, and Gideon had chased him down at the park just yesterday to get him to stay away from a family of geese. "Going to the park?" "Yeah," Gideon said. "What's going on with that?" "Oh, it keeps stalling." Daddy looked over to Gideon. "You're really going back to Austin in the fall?" Gideon sighed and looked away. "Yes, Daddy." It was July, and Gideon had finally told his parents he wanted to return to the university in Austin in the fall instead of staying to work the family ranch. He loved it here, under the shade of all the trees, the still air, especially at night, that allowed a man to truly think, and the scent of horses and freshly mown hay. He'd worked hard growing up, and he didn't mind it. But the fact was, Gideon was the middle son. He'd never expected to inherit the ranch, and he'd only just realized that his father had wanted him to go to college, and then Gideon was expected to come home and work the ranch. That was just what Walkers did. Gideon didn't want to be that brand of Walker. His father returned to the lawnmower, and Gideon wondered if it really wasn't running. His father loved to tinker with mechanical things, and Gideon didn't hate it either. He whistled for Mac and Moose because he was tired of this same old conversation. Mac came trotting over, and Gideon held up his fist, the universal sign to get the dog to sit. Mac just stood there, panting, and Gideon rolled his eyes as he clipped the leash to the dog's collar. He looked around for Moose, but the other dog had disappeared. "I think you and Jonas and Spencer can work the ranch together," Daddy said. "That's what we've always planned for." Gideon usually enjoyed the personal connection he and his daddy had, and all of his best memories had originated in this garage while they fiddled with something or organized lumber for a new construction project or held their ranch meetings. Only Jonas and Daddy met about the ranch now, though, and Gideon hadn't even been told the truth. He didn't want to hurt his father, but he'd never been completely honest with him about why he wanted to go back to Austin this fall. He'd never revealed what he knew. "I don't want the ranch," Gideon said. "What are you going to do then?" "I already told you, Daddy. I want to go back to school." "You graduated." Gideon drew in a deep breath through his nose. "I know. I got a degree in business. I could buy my own ranch, or help run this one right. But I don't want to." He wanted to explore so much more of the world than Sweet Creek in the Texas Hill Country. The world was wide open right now, and the possibilities felt absolutely endless to Gideon. "What are you going to do?" his dad asked again. "Well," Gideon tried to choose his words carefully. His father got overwhelmed easily, especially with new things, the very things that brought excitement to Gideon's soul. "You've heard of the microwave oven? Someone invented that. And I was reading an article the other day about fiber optics, Daddy. They can send pulses of light through a fiber. A fiber? And Gideon had lost him. There are people working on so many things. He continued anyway. The space program uses computers, and they're getting smaller and smaller. He started speaking faster, trying to get his point across before his father started shaking his head and waving his hand, a signal that he was done listening. People invent those things, Daddy. I want to learn the technology. I want to invent the things people will use in the future. The need to do so practically seethed beneath his skin, making standing still difficult and uncomfortable. Gideon didn't want to stand still. He wanted to get out there in the world and do something. So you're going to go work at NASA? Maybe, Gideon said, but not right away. I need to take more classes. You've just spent the last 4 years in classes. Gideon sighed because this was a losing conversation. He wished things could be different, but the fact was they couldn't. I know you had Jonas sign the documents to make the ranch his. That got Daddy to stop tinkering with the blasted lawnmower. His eyes met Gideon's, and he saw so much of himself in the dark depths. Everything about the Walker men existed in shades of darkness. Dark hair, and Daddy's was some of the darkest. Gideon's was lighter, though not by much. Dark brown eyes, and again, Daddy had the deepest, darkest pair. Gideon's rivaled his, though, especially when he was frustrated or angry. He tanned easily, and he seemed to be able to eat whatever he wanted and still stay trim. His height contributed to that, and the fact that he'd once loved to lift his father's barbells, which he kept in the barn before he left for school each day. Moose came bounding toward the garage, and Gideon masked his frustrated sigh as a grunt as he bent to clip the second leash onto the dog's collar. Moose was a big, hairy brown dog who was named after the animal he most represented. The mutt had long legs that didn't seem to move the right way, so he always seemed one step away from falling completely. He had a big snout, too, and he loved to run around the park and sniff everything, and everyone he could. Most people around Sweet Creek knew Moose, because while he was big and clumsy, he at least had some intelligence. There wasn't a dog kennel in the county that could hold Moose, and not just because of his size. Gideon swore the dog's paws morphed into human hands when he was alone, because he could open doors. "Come on," he said to the two dogs. "Load up. We're going to the park." His father watched him, still silent and not admitting that he'd passed the ranch to Jonas, which everyone knew left nothing for Gideon or Spencer. "Mama's got dinner on," his dad said as Gideon got behind the wheel. "I won't be late," Gideon promised, and he got off the ranch as quickly as he could without spitting gravel behind his tires. He wanted to, but he knew from experience that his show of anger would only land him in hotter water with Daddy. "Work the ranch together," Gideon scoffed. "There's no together if Jonas owns the whole thing, Daddy." He continued to rant as he drove to town. Sweet Creek wasn't a huge place in the hill country, but it had a decent number of people in town and the surrounding hills. Probably 10,000 or so. Their department stores had the microwave ovens Gideon had spoken of, though his mama hadn't purchased one. When they'd first been introduced, Fisher's had put one in the front display window and done hourly demonstrations. Gideon remembered them clearly, and perhaps that had been when the invention bug had bitten him. No, he told himself. You've always wanted to push the boundaries, explore the new, make something out of nothing. And that was true. Gideon Walker had the drive and intelligence to invent, and he wouldn't settle for working a ranch he didn't own and had no chance of owning. "There's no future for me here." He wanted to be somewhere important. Somewhere where things happened, where men thought outside of boxes and where fences didn't exist. He pulled up to the sprawling park across the street from the church he'd attended for the first 18 years of his life. For a moment, relief pulled through him. After he threw the ball for Moose and managed to tucker out Mac, Perhaps he could go sit down on one of the benches and pray for guidance. The wind picked up, and Gideon pressed his hand down on his cowboy hat so it wouldn't get stolen. Heaven knew he'd lost plenty of hats to a stiff breeze, especially around these parts of Texas. "Come on," he said to the dogs. "Now stay by me, okay? There are a lot of people here today." Summer in Texas usually took people to the water parks, the rivers, the lakes. This park had a lake in the middle of it and plenty of grass surrounding that. Enormous cypress trees kept things shaded, and families brought blankets and picnic baskets to spend afternoons together. Couples snuck off to the more private parts of the park, and Gideon had seen black rabbits in the park year-round. Mac especially liked to chase them, and Gideon swept the patch of park he'd chosen for the dogs. It was remote enough, hopefully, to keep them entertained but out of other people's hair. Mac didn't have personal boundaries, and he thought everyone he met had just come to give him a pat. Moose didn't know his own strength, that was all. They were both kind, gentle dogs. They just required the right kind of person to love them. Gideon did love them, but not as much as Daddy. Daddy had always loved dogs, and they had at least 15 on the ranch. Maybe more. Momma had put her foot down when the third dog had started coming inside to sleep and eat, and Daddy got more dogs as a way to rescue them. "Stay by me," he told the dogs again, and he picked up the ball Moose loved to chase. He threw it as far as he could and reached for the bowl he'd fill with water from the drinking fountain. No beast, man or canine, could go long in the July Texas heat without a good, long, cold drink of water. Gideon's mouth felt dry right that instant, in fact. He watched Moose and Mac chase after the ball. Moose got it, of course. Mac didn't even seem to know there was a ball present, but he loved to run alongside his friend. "Bring it," Gideon called. But Moose just dropped the ball and trotted over to a tree, his sniffer working overtime. Irritation flared in Gideon's soul. "Just bring it back," he muttered as he started across the lawn toward the pair of dogs. He kept his eyes on them, because they could bolt at a moment's notice. Thankfully they didn't, and he picked up the ball and threw it again. Both dogs took off after it, and once again Moose retrieved it, but didn't bring it back. "Come on," he called. "Bring it." He should have brought some jerky or liver with him, but he'd been too frustrated by his conversation with his father to think of it. Moose lifted his head suddenly, and Gideon yelled his name. But the dog wouldn't be deterred, and he took off at a sprint. "No!" Gideon called. "Moose, come back! Come back!" He broke into a jog, too, though his cowboy boots weren't really made for running on grass. Various trees made it hard to see what had sparked Moose's attention. A squeal filled the air, followed by a hearty feminine laugh, and Gideon rounded a tree to find both of his dogs, tails wagging, standing over a woman on the ground. "Guys," he said, his heart beat the thing that was sprinting now. "Come on, leave her alone." He ran toward her, saying, "I'm sorry. Moose, Mac, come on." But both dogs had gone deaf, and Gideon wanted to march them right over to the truck and lecture them the whole way back to the ranch. Back to the ranch. Boy, he didn't want to go back there. "Sorry." He reached the blanket where the woman had been sitting and managed to wrestle Moose away from her. His long tongue still tried to lick her face while Gideon reached for Mac. "Go on now. Sit down. Stay." Miraculously, the dogs did what he said, and Gideon turned his attention to the woman with the splay of dark auburn hair across her face. She giggled like getting attacked by two 70-pound dogs was the highlight of her day, and then she sat up, brushing her hair off her face. Gideon froze at the sight of the most beautiful woman he'd ever met. Along with the auburn hair, she had smooth tan skin, straight white teeth, and the loveliest pair of green eyes he'd ever seen. "It's fine," she drawled, grinning at him. "I love dogs." He extended his hand toward her, the motion he'd been about to make before she'd made his heart start to beat in a strange way. She put her hand in his, and he helped her to her feet. She brushed a couple of leaves and plenty of grass from her pants, which flared at the ankle but hugged her thigh. She was slim, but what she lacked in physicality she made up for in charisma. She wore a mauve sweater that accentuated her curves, with a deep neckline that Gideon yanked his eyes away from. All he could do was return the smile that still sat on her face. She seemed made of sunshine and charm, and Gideon wanted to know everything about her. "I'm Gideon Walker," he said, extending his hand toward her again. He'd been numb the last time her skin had touched his, but this time he felt every spark of attraction moving through him. "Penny." "Short for something?" he asked, barely keeping an eye on the dogs. He only seemed to have eyes for her now. "Penelope." He nodded. "Do you live around here, Penny?" "Yeah," she said, grinning as Mac ran toward her. She bent down and scratched behind his ears. "My family owns the egg farm south of town." She glanced up at him, and Gideon nearly lost himself in those eyes. That smile. "Aarons is my last name." "Oh, right," he said. "The Aarons egg farm. I've been by there." She straightened, and Gideon reached down deep inside himself for another round of courage. "Would you like to go to dinner with me?" "Hey, Penny," a man said as he came around the tree. "They didn't have anything but water." He looked at Gideon and Mac and moved right to Penny's side. He handed her a bottle of water, which Penny took and twisted off the cap. "Thanks, Lee." She smiled at him, too, and Gideon's heart flopped like a fish out of water. She'd heard him ask her out. He couldn't take the words back. "This is Gideon," she said to Lee before turning to Gideon. "And this is Lee." "Nice to meet you," Gideon said, but he didn't think it was nice at all. Moose barked, and Gideon turned away in time to see the dogs streak away. "Sorry again about the dogs." He strode away, never more grateful for the disobedient canines than he was in that moment. He rounded them up and threw the ball a few more times, forcing himself not to even look to his right. Penny hadn't even seemed surprised when he'd asked her to dinner, but Gideon kept wondering where the words had come from. He wasn't shy with women. He simply hadn't really met anyone he'd wanted to go out with for very long. Penny's laughing green eyes stuck with him long after he'd loaded up the dogs and driven back to the ranch. Maybe Lee was just her brother. Maybe she would have said yes to his dinner invitation if they hadn't been interrupted. "Aaron's egg farm," he muttered to himself as he closed up the horse barn for the night. His family ranch sat north and west of town, with the egg farm south. He knew of the Aarons, but he didn't know much more about them. He definitely wanted to learn more. Chapter 2. Penelope Aarons had just stepped back into the house after a morning of crating eggs when her brother Darren looked up from his bowl of cereal, probably his third or fourth bowl. "There's a guy here for you," he said in a bored voice. Penny looked toward the sitting room, which she couldn't actually see because the door leading from the front of the house to the back of it was closed. Her mother taught piano lessons in the sitting room, which was immediately off the front entrance, and with that door closed, the rest of the family didn't have to listen to Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star on repeat. "Is Mama teaching this morning?" "She finished," Darren said, turning a page in the newspaper. "Who is it?" "I can't keep track of the boys who come asking for you, Pen," Darren said, glancing up. "He was wearing a cowboy hat." "Thanks. That's so helpful," Penny said. But that one tidbit told her something. It wouldn't be Lee. Lee didn't stop by the house without making plans with her first anyway. Penny stepped over to the kitchen sink and started washing her hands. Who had she met in the past few days that would go to the trouble of looking up where she lived and then come by? Her heartbeat fluttered in her chest. The cowboy with the dogs. At the park. Gideon Walker. "Mama's chatting him up," Darren said.
You might want to hurry. He's been here at least 10 minutes already.
What did you tell him? She couldn't entertain hope for the man to be Gideon. They'd barely talked, though he had asked her to dinner. Penny was used to being asked out, honestly, and she almost always went. Darren wasn't lying when he said he couldn't keep track of the men who came around the house. Penny could barely keep track of them.
I said you were working, but you should be done in a few minutes. He said he'd wait.
Darren turned another page, clearly not reading anything in the paper.
Mama finished her lesson and now they're talking.
Okay. Penny dried her hands and took a big breath, her slight shoulders lifting and falling quickly.
It's just another guy, Pen,
Darren said without looking at her.
You'll laugh with him and have him buy you dinner, and then you'll tell him you're leaving for Austin in a month, and that will be that.
Yeah, probably, Penny said. She needed to have that conversation with Lee, too. She liked him, but he had no ambition, no drive, no vision beyond Sweet Creek and what he already had here. Penny wanted more. She didn't care that she was the only female student in the pre-law program at UT Austin. She could handle the snide remarks and sexist comments from her male counterparts. All she had to do was study harder than them, score higher than them. They'd take her seriously one day. She walked past her brother at the dining room table and turned toward the front door. She opened the closed door separating her and the sitting room and paused as her mom laughed lightly. "I'll go check on her," she said, and Penny stepped into the room and came face to face with her mother. "Oh, here she is." Mama's eyes held sparkle and hope as she widened them, mouthing, "He's great." Penny nodded and looked past her mother to see who'd come by. Sure enough, Gideon Walker stood there, and Penny suddenly felt like she should have done more than just wash her hands. She should have showered, and blown out her hair, and put on makeup and perfume, and changed out of her stinky egg-crating clothes.
"Hey,"
Gideon said, taking a step forward. Penny heard the soft click of the door behind her as her mother left the room. He scanned her from head to toe, a smile forming on that strong mouth. It fit solidly on his face, which bore a square jaw with plenty of sexy stubble that was nearly black. Tall, dark, handsome. He had it all. "Hello." Penny reached up and self-consciously tucked her hair, her gaze dropping to Gideon's hands, which went round and round each other. So he was nervous, too. Penny wasn't even sure what to do with her nerves. She wasn't used to having them when it came to men. She knew she was beautiful because everyone told her she was. She'd developed early, and she'd had boys calling the house and waiting along the fence where she walked from the egg warehouse to her house to talk to her in the morning before junior high school.
"Your mother says you crate the eggs in the morning,"
he said, reaching up to adjust that delectable cowboy hat. Penny had grown up and graduated from high school in Texas, and she sure did like cowboys. Gideon had all the right pieces, too. The hat, the boots, the jeans with barely a flare. This morning, Penny wore a blue pair of shorts, as the warehouse didn't have air conditioning in the packing area, and a bright blue blouse that likely had smeared egg yolk on it. "Yeah, working, among other things," she said. "But today was crating." "Mm-hmm." She put a smile on her face, hoping it would calm them both. "What brings you by?" Gideon looked like he might throw up, and his anxiety actually helped her settle further.
"I was hoping you'd tell me that guy you were with at the park the other day was your brother."
He nodded toward the door behind her.
"Then I met your brother, and I know he wasn't."
He exhaled and removed his cowboy hat with one hand and ran his hand through his thick, dark hair with the other.
"But I couldn't get myself to leave."
Penny indicated the chair her mom had likely been sitting in. She took it, and Gideon regained his seat, too.
"I know you heard me ask you to dinner, and I'm wondering what the possibility of that is."
Penny folded her hands in her lap and cocked her head at him. "I'm seeing Lee."
"Are you?"
Penny knew he'd seen her with him. She hadn't tried to hide her relationship with him in the park. Gideon had seen her. A sigh blew out of her mouth. "I mean, yes."
"It sounds like you're not sure."
"Summer's almost over," she said.
"Oh, so it's a fling,"
Gideon said. "No." Penny straightened her back, a fire roaring to life inside her. "I don't do flings."
"But you'll break up with him when you go back to school."
Gideon watched her with a pair of dancing dark eyes, the intensity in them calling to Penny. She felt the same intensity bubbling inside of her, too, and she wondered if she'd finally met a man who could keep up with her. Most of her boyfriends hadn't been able to. She hadn't been out with anyone for longer than 4 months, and her relationship with Lee was half of that. And about to be over, she thought, as Gideon put his forearms on his knees and studied her. "Yes," she finally said. "I'm planning to break up with him when I go back to Austin. Happy now?" Gideon grinned. He even chuckled a little bit.
"Not even slightly, Miss Penny. The only thing that would make me happy right now is you telling me we can go to dinner together."
"Persistent, aren't you?"
"When I know what I want."
"I'm not an object to be had," she said.
"Oh, I know that, ma'am."
He stood up, that gorgeous smile making him twice as handsome. He wasn't nervous anymore either, and Penny liked that too. She wanted a man who would provide for her and protect her, not someone to placate her or kowtow to everything she said. Gideon stepped toward the front door and opened it. Pausing in the doorway, he turned back to her.
"If you think you could break up with Lee earlier, I'll be at the Capitol tonight at 7. If you want to eat together, I'm sure I'll have an extra chair at my table."
With that, he walked out, and Penny sat there stunned. She jumped to her feet and hurried the few steps to the doorway, bracing herself against the door jamb as she watched Gideon walk back to his truck. The 2 big dogs that she'd met in the park stood in the back, both of them with their front paws up on the wheel well, smiling at her with their tongues hanging out. Gideon glanced at her as he got behind the wheel, but he didn't smile or tip his hat. Penny giggled to herself as he backed out of the driveway, her mind racing in several different directions. She stepped out of the doorway and closed the door, then went into the kitchen. "Well?" Mama stood at the sink, her hands sudsy. "Well, what?" Penny asked. Mama rolled her eyes. "Don't be cute with me. He's so much more than anyone else you've been out with." "That's because he's older than me." "Praise the Lord," Mama said. "Aren't you tired of dating boys barely out of high school?" Penny was. Yes. She admitted it, which only fueled Mama's tongue. "Then you go out with Gideon. He's very nice, Pen. Articulate, educated, smart, that one. I could tell just by looking at him." "Yeah," Penny said, because she'd been able to tell the same thing. "He wants me to go to dinner with him tonight at the Capitol." "Great," Mama said, though she literally loathed the Capitol. She wouldn't go there anymore because the last time she'd been, they'd charged her to switch the brown gravy for country gravy. Penny shook her head, but she couldn't shake the smile in her soul. "I'm going to go read and shower," she said. "Are you going to go to dinner with him?" "I haven't decided yet," Penny said as she walked away. She couldn't decide as she showered. She tried reading, but the book couldn't hold her attention. She had a few chores on the farm in the afternoon, and as she went down the rows of chickens to feed them, she considered going back to the house and getting ready to drive to town. She could take her mother's station wagon, as Mama had offered it to her when Penny went running out the back door to feed the chickens. But back at the house, she didn't start getting ready to go to dinner. She had a few hours anyway, and she sat down in front of the sewing machine in her bedroom. Penny loved to sew, and she'd learned from her grandmother when she was a little girl. She couldn't remember a time when the needle and thread, The fabrics and patterns hadn't soothed her. Her mind whirred with the machine as she continued to work on a dress she'd been making for a couple of days. It would be ready for church on Sunday, and she had a vision of walking into the chapel wearing her new dress and scanning the congregation for Gideon Walker. She sat back from the dress, having just finished a seam. She left it right where it was and glanced at the clock. 5:30. She had time to get ready and get to the Capitol. Her pulse skipped every third beat as she fixed her hair just right and applied makeup. She couldn't believe she was going to do this. She barely knew Gideon Walker. "Mama," she called as she went racing down the steps. She turned toward the kitchen, saying, "Mama, I need the—" She cut off when she met her mother's eyes. Wide and round, she nodded past Penny to the sitting room while she dried her hands on a kitchen towel. "What is it?" she asked.
"Lee's here,"
Daddy said, stepping over to her. He pressed a kiss to her forehead.
"You sure look nice, sweetheart. Where's he taking you tonight?"
"I don't know," Penny said. She didn't have plans with Lee that night. She stepped away from her father, her chest stinging as she walked into the sitting room. Lee was her boyfriend, though, and she definitely needed to fix her relationship status before she went romping off to the Capitol to meet another man. Sure enough, Lee sat in the sitting room, in the same chair Gideon had been in that morning, and he didn't even get up when she entered. "Lee," she said, seeing her romantic dinner with Gideon fade before her eyes. "What are you doing here?" Chapter 3. Gideon thanked the waitress as she set down a plate of bacon and cheese fries, the smile that came to his face only lasting for a blip in time. He couldn't help glancing toward the entrance to the restaurant as he picked up his napkin and put it on his lap. Penny didn't walk in.
"She's not going to,"
he muttered to himself. Foolishness filled him from top to bottom, and it undulated through him in waves. He had no idea what had possessed him to show up at her house unannounced and act like he was the king of the world, inviting her to dinner with him when she had a boyfriend. Not only that, but Gideon didn't meet women for dinner. He went to their house and picked them up, like a proper gentleman. The bacon and cheese didn't even soothe him, and when the waitress returned, she looked concerned. "Everything all right?" she drawled, looking at his nearly full plates.
"Yes,"
Gideon said, trying on that smile again.
"Honestly, it's great. I'm just not feeling well."
He dropped his napkin on the table beside his steak sandwich.
"Can you box it all up for me?"
"Sure thing." She took his food and Gideon got his money out in the few minutes it took for her to return. "Hope you feel better," she said.
"Thanks."
Gideon's foul feelings had nothing to do with the food, but he took it all home anyway. He didn't go inside the homestead, though, because then he'd have to explain himself. He hadn't told his parents he was meeting a woman for dinner, because he was 22 years old, and he didn't need their permission to drive the truck he owned to town and eat. He sat on the front porch with Moose and Mac, his mind moving through his next steps. They changed every other second, though, and Gideon couldn't believe Penny Aarons hadn't shown up. He'd been so sure she would. He could feel a snapping, crackling energy between them, but maybe she hadn't. She sure hadn't liked him calling her relationship with Lee a fling, but honestly, that was what it was.
"Yeah, and you're going back to Austin in a month, too,"
he told himself.
"So what are you doing?" "She said she'd go back to Austin, too,"
his mind whispered at him.
"They'd be in the same city."
He could definitely see her for longer than a month. New scenarios ran through his mind now, but in the end, Gideon dismissed them all. He wasn't going to go back to the Aarons egg farm again. Penny knew his intentions. He'd asked her out twice now, shown up at her house unannounced, and talked with her mother for a good 15 minutes before Penny had come into the room. He'd been bold and to the point, because he saw no reason to act otherwise. If she didn't like him, she didn't like him. He wasn't going to make a bigger fool of himself. Sighing, he finally went inside the homestead when darkness began to cover the ranch. Thankfully, Mama had turned off the lights in the kitchen already, and Gideon didn't have to explain anything to anyone. The next morning, Gideon woke early as usual. He went out onto the ranch, the same as he'd done for many mornings over many years. He opened the horse barn and fed the horses, Mac and Moose never too far from him. Jonas and Spencer and Daddy all worked around the ranch too, but Gideon kept his head down, the brim of his cowboy hat obscuring his face, and simply got the job done. When he left for Austin again, Jonas would hire on a new man, just as he'd done for the past 4 years. There was nothing for him to feel guilty about. Jonas owned the ranch now. It was up to him to work it. He'd been dating a woman named Rosalie for several months now, but Gideon hadn't heard any talk of marriage or a wedding. He finished with the horses and had just left the barn when Moose started barking. He and Mac ran toward the homestead and around the side of it at top speed, their voices so loud in the quietness of the ranch.
"What's that about?"
Daddy asked as he came out of the calf shed.
"I'll go see,"
Gideon said.
"It's probably just one of Mama's friends. Wasn't she doing that preserves exchange?"
Daddy said, already distracted by something else. Gideon followed the dogs around the house to find a brown station wagon parked in front of the homestead. A woman laughed at the dogs, and Gideon's feet froze to the ground and his chest seized up, making his heart work twice as hard to beat in the now cramped space. He knew that laugh, though he'd only heard it one other time. Penny Aaron straightened and glanced toward the house. "Where is he, guys, huh?" He forced himself to keep walking, and her eyes came to his. The smile slipped from her face despite Moose's attempts to cheer her up. "Hey," she said, lifting her hand in a half-hearted wave. "I'm glad I found the right place."
"The arch gives us away,"
Gideon said. Everyone in Texas had a gate leading onto their property, and Daddy had erected an arch above the dirt lane that led back into these trees. The name Walker had been carved into the wood in huge letters, and surely she hadn't wondered if she'd found the right ranch. "Yes," she said. "It was a bit obvious." She turned and looked down the road she'd driven up. "I've just never been up this far, and I wasn't sure if I'd passed it or what." He noticed a brown bag clutched in her hand.
"What are you doing here?"
he asked. She brought her eyes back to his, and Gideon thought that was entirely unfair. She had to know what those big green eyes did to a man, and boy, did she know how to use them. Right now, they filled with regret and compassion, and Gideon wanted to assure her that everything was fine. He was fine. Something nagged at him that said he wasn't. She lifted the brown paper sack. "I brought breakfast."
"If that's not a cream cheese bear claw, you can get in the car and go," he teased.
Her whole countenance lit up, and Gideon couldn't help basking in the glow of it. Today, she wore a pink blouse covered in a flowery print and a pair of those flared jeans. She obviously kept up with the fashions of the day, and she seemed entirely out of his league. "As a matter of fact," she said, opening the bag, "that's exactly what I brought." He closed the distance to where she stood at the front of her car and peered inside the bag. A cream cheese bear claw sat there. He lifted his gaze to hers.
"How did you know?"
"Lucky guess," she said.
"No one's that lucky."
He indicated the porch steps and added,
"Do you want to sit down for a minute?"
"Sure." They moved over to the steps and sat, both dogs following them like shadows. She took his bear claw out of the bag with a napkin and handed both to him. "I got myself a raspberry fritter."
"I like those too,"
he said,
"but not as much as these."
He took a big bite of the pastry, the sweet and creamy taste of it making his taste buds sing. She smiled and took a much more delicate bite of her breakfast. She dusted off her hands and swallowed only a moment later. "I'm really sorry I didn't come last night." Gideon's throat narrowed, but he took another enormous bite of the bear claw anyway. He didn't want to talk about last night. "I wanted to," she said. "I was ready and everything, and then Lee showed up." Gideon nodded, his imagination conjuring up an image of the two of them dancing the night away. Penny definitely seemed like the type of woman to enjoy dancing, and Gideon wanted to hold her in his arms and experience her smile and laughter as they twirled together. "I broke up with him," she said, nudging Gideon with her shoulder. "You did?" He looked at her, surprise streaming through him. "Yeah," Penny said, gazing out over the front yard. "You were right. I was going to break up with him anyway." She smiled and ducked her head. After she took another bite of her fritter, chewed and swallowed, she added, "There's this other man I kinda wanted to go out with, too." Hope exploded through Gideon, but he managed to tame his voice into normalcy when he asked, "Is that right?" "Yeah, that's right." "Lucky man," Gideon said, and that caused Penny to laugh. The light, carefree, feminine sound of it dove right into his ears, and he sure did like the sound of it. He chuckled, too, and Penny linked her arm through his and let her forearm rest on his thigh. "It's you, Gideon Walker, if you'll forgive me for standing you up last night." He looked at her, but they were sitting so close, it almost made him go cross-eyed. He focused out in front of him again as Moose finally laid down. "I think I can do that," he said, his voice definitely a little gruff now. "Good." Penny pressed her shoulder against Gideon's, and they sat on the front porch in silence while they finished their breakfast. Gideon loved the peace this ranch had always provided for him, and after he'd brushed the crumbs from his hands, he asked, "So, dinner tonight? I can come pick you up nice and proper this time." "Yes," Penny said. 6:30? He asked. "That works." She stood, a sigh coming from her mouth. "I better get going. I told my mama I wouldn't be gone long and she needs the car this afternoon." "Okay." Gideon got to his feet too and walked with Penny toward the station wagon. "You're going to UT Austin, right?" he asked. "That's right," she said. "You?" "I graduated in the spring," he said, "but I'm going back to take more classes. I'm hoping to get a job at one of the tech firms in the area. Texas Instruments, IBM, Tracer." He didn't dare hope too hard for any of them, though he thought he was qualified. "How old are you?" she asked. 22, he said. "You?" 19, she said. "I'm only starting my second year of college." Gideon smiled at her and opened her door for her. "But you like it?" "I love it," she said, her voice taking on new energy. "I'm going to be a lawyer." She held herself up tall and proud, too, and Gideon found her so attractive in that moment. "I bet you will be," he said, tipping his hat. "You go on now. I don't want your mother mad at me because you're late." Penny stepped between him and the door, and Gideon felt like he positively towered above her. She was petite and proper, charming and charismatic. She was everything he wanted on the outside, and he hoped to get to know her on the inside so he could determine if they could build a life together. "See you at 6:30, she said, and she got behind the wheel of the car, closed the door, and backed out of his driveway. Gideon watched her go, both dogs coming to stand beside him. Mac whined, and he said, "Yeah, I wish she could stay longer, too," as he reached down to pat the dog's head. Chapter 4. Penny shrugged into the blouse she'd just put the buttons on, and it felt good against her skin. "Mama," she called as she left her bedroom. Down the hall, and then down the steps, Penny found her mother in the kitchen. She had a whisk in her hands, and she was whipping up a huge bowl of eggs. The Aarons family ate a lot of eggs, and Penny was glad she wouldn't be around for dinner tonight, though she did love her mother's sweet and savory scrambled egg sliders. "What about this?" Penny asked, adjusting the white fabric so that it wasn't too far off her shoulder. Her mother wouldn't like that, and she already knew that Penny liked Gideon more than anyone she'd been out with that year. "Too plain?" "It's lovely," Mama said. A fond look covered her expression, and she left the whisk in the bowl to come around the counter. "Not everything has to be covered in a print." "Prints are really popular right now," Penny said, looking down at the blouse. "I tried to dress it up with the ruffles and pleats." The blouse was really form-fitting, but with the extra fabric in the pleats that ran up her rib cage, she didn't feel like she was showing everything. "I do like it." "It's adorable," Mama said, and Penny jerked her attention to her mother. "I'm not a puppy, Mother," she said, "and I don't want Gideon to think I'm adorable. I want him to think I'm beautiful, sophisticated even." Worry danced through her as she watched her mom fiddle with the fabric along her waist. She'd barely made the blouse long enough, and she knew her mother didn't like that it barely sat along the waistband of her shorts. Penny wouldn't even be wearing these shorts, and the lower bell-bottom she was planning to wear would definitely show a little bit of her stomach. If she could get out of the house like that, it would be a miracle, and Penny had been praying for exactly that for the whole afternoon as she sat at the sewing machine. "He's older than me, Mama. I don't want him to think I'm cute or adorable like his little sister." "Penny." Her mother smiled and shook her head. She reached out and tucked Penny's hair behind her ear. "You can be beautiful and pure, too. You'll be one of the smartest women he's ever met." She nodded like what she said was gospel law and turned back to the kitchen. "I think you should wear jeans with that shirt. You don't want to show too much skin. That doesn't say beautiful or sophisticated. That says desperate." "I'm planning on wearing jeans," Penny said. "Or that green denim skirt I got a couple of months ago." "Oh, that would be nice," she said, picking up the bowl again. "With the white sandals we got from Aunt Matilda." "I'll go try them on," Penny said. She went back upstairs to try on the skirt and then the jeans. She normally paid attention to what she wore, sure, but not this much. She usually picked out something she felt confident and pretty in and deemed it good. Gideon had introduced something new into her life she hadn't felt with a man in a while. Butterflies, excitement, nerves. She wanted to impress him. Truth be told, she was a little desperate to do exactly that. She went with the jeans because they were more fashionable than the skirt, with the flared bottoms and the slim fit through her hips and waist. They definitely made her look skinnier than she was, though she barely carried any extra weight. The sandals couldn't be seen with the wide jeans, but Penny kept them on her feet anyway. She took care with her makeup, moving methodically to apply the right amount of color to her cheeks to make herself look older, but not like she was trying too hard. Penny was trying hard, but she didn't want to look like she was. She still had a few pieces of hair to iron straight when the doorbell rang. She sucked in a breath, her fingers slipping a little on the flat iron. She heard her mother's voice downstairs as she'd pitched it up a little as she greeted Gideon. "Calm down," Penny coached herself under her breath. He was just another man. She'd been out with dozens of them. As she unplugged the hair iron and went downstairs, she had the very real thought that Gideon was anything but just another man. One step into the sitting room proved that, as she found him grinning at her mother and saying something that made her laugh. Her father touched her waist, and Penny inched out of the way so he could meet Gideon, too. Gideon's eyes met hers from across the room, and something locked in place between them. He shook her father's hand, his smile brilliant and filling the whole room, the whole house. He was charming and simply gorgeous in that dark cowboy hat, a short-sleeved blue paisley shirt, and a pair of black pants. When her parents turned back to her, Penny could see Gideon had charmed them to the gills. Even her father had a glow Penny rarely saw, and she smiled at her mother and father and nodded as they went through the doorway and into the back of the house. "Ready?" Gideon asked, tucking his hands into his pockets. "Yes," Penny said. "I'm ready." She walked across the room toward him, expecting him to step back and open the front door so she could go through in front of him. He didn't budge. Instead, he reached for her with both hands, and she put hers in his.
"You look amazing,"
he said.
"Stunning. Simply beautiful."
He smiled at her, the energy snapping in his eyes making her own nerves vibrate even more. "Thank you," she said, ducking her head. "You look very nice, too."
"This is my brother's shirt,"
he said with a chuckle.
"He dates a lot more than I do."
He released one of her hands and opened the door. Penny went outside first, never letting go of his hand. "You don't date?" Penny asked once they were side by side, walking toward his truck. It was an older model and had probably been white once upon a time. It was more of a light gray now, with some chips down the side of it. She liked that he didn't exude money, because it meant he lived within his means.
"Not much, no,"
he said. "Why not?"
"I don't know. Probably because I never really met anyone who made me want to shower twice in one day."
Penny burst out laughing, thrilled when he joined her. "Well, I'm glad I inspired that in you." He opened her door for her, and Penny climbed into the cab of the truck, glad she'd chosen the pants over the skirt. Gideon rounded the front of the vehicle and got behind the wheel.
"All right. There's a concert happening on Main Street tonight. It's a staged concert, so we get to hear one band at Miller's. They'll serve appetizers. Then we get 20 minutes to get to Kitty's Kitchen, where we get to see another local Texas band, and they'll serve a salad course there."
"I've heard of this," Penny said. "The Progressive Dinner and Concert Night. I didn't realize they were doing that in Sweet Creek."
"It's the first one,"
he said. "How did you get tickets?" Penny had read in the paper several weeks ago that these progressive country music dinners sold out quickly, at least in places like Austin and San Antonio. The one she'd read about had been in Fredericksburg, which was a much bigger town in the hill country than Sweet Creek.
"I had to call in a favor,"
he said, glancing at her as he put the truck in drive after backing out.
"But I got them, and I think it'll be an interesting experience."
"How many bands?" she asked.
4 tonight,"
he said.
"Appetizer, salad, main course, dessert. It'll be a couple of hours at least."
"I'm excited," she said. Number one, he'd planned a real date. He'd showered, twice, and he'd come to her door to pick her up. As he rumbled down the road toward the highway, Penny shook her hair over her shoulders. "So, Gideon Walker, tell me what you want from life." He looked at her, alarm in his expression.
"What I want from life?"
"Yeah," she said.
"That's a huge thing,"
he said. "Surely you have dreams and goals," she said. He certainly seemed like the type of man who would. Penny didn't want a handsome man on her arm who had no goals. "I'll go first if you want."
"Sure,"
he said. "I'm going to be one of the first female lawyers to graduate from UT Austin," she said. "And I want to be a mother." Gideon cleared his throat, and Penny wondered if she'd come on too strong. Again.
"I remember the lawyer part,"
he said, shifting in his seat. He pulled up to the stop sign and looked at her instead of turning onto the highway.
"How many children do you want?"
"As many as the good Lord will give me," Penny said. Gideon blinked, and Penny mentally kicked herself for being so bold. At the same time, she wanted to be herself, and she had no problem speaking her mind. If Gideon didn't like that, well, maybe this would be their first and last date. Then a smile spread across his face, and he chuckled. The sound grew and grew into a full, round laugh. He pulled onto the highway while his laughter lingered, and while Penny smiled, she didn't laugh with him.
"I like you, Penelope Aarons,"
he said.
"You know what you want, that's for sure."
Penny folded her arms, unsure if he'd just complimented her or not. "What do you want?"
"I like technology,"
he said.
"I have a degree in business, but what I really want to do is work in technology."
He glanced at her.
You know, computers and stuff.
I've heard of computers, she said dryly. His grin didn't fade even 1 degree.
I'm sure you have.
So you want to work in technology? She prompted.
Yeah,
he said.
In fact, earlier today I applied to those places we talked about this morning.
Penny turned away from him and smiled out the passenger window. That's great.
Yeah, I'm just taking 3 classes in the fall and I need a job.
I'm assuming you work the ranch for your family in the summer.
Yes,
he said.
It's enough to pay for a semester. I need to work to save for the next one and to pay for my apartment and everything.
Impressive, she said, and she was impressed by him. Do you want a family?
Sure,
he said, down the line. Down the line?
Yeah,
he said,
when the time is right.
Penny watched him out of the corner of her eye, and he seemed perfectly comfortable with her. She liked that, liked the way he drove with one hand lazily draped over the steering wheel, liked that he fiddled with the radio to get it tuned in better. So you don't know what you want? She asked.
I need some time to boil it down,
he said.
Can I have some time to think about it?
Sure, she said. Of course.
Great.
He glanced at her.
I usually lead with easier questions, like how many siblings do you have?
He grinned widely then, his teeth white and perfectly straight. Penny giggled, glad everything between them was so easy. I have 3 older brothers, she said. I think you met Darren the other day when you stopped by. He nodded, so she kept going. He's the oldest, and he's running our trucking operation right now. Brandon is next, and he's 24, and he runs the egg operation. He sells to the grocery stores and restaurants, all of that.
Interesting,
Gideon said. And Andrew is 21, and he works the farm with my brothers and father. He wants to learn to drive one of the big rigs, but the school is expensive, and he hasn't taken that leap yet.
And you want to be a lawyer,
Gideon said.
That's not anything like running an egg farm or a trucking business.
Nope, she said. I crate the eggs and feed a building of chickens and anything else that needs to be done. That way I have the money I need to go to school.
You love your family.
Yes, she said. You?
I do love my family,
he said.
I'm the middle son, and my father recently transferred ownership of the ranch to Jonas, my older brother. Spencer is younger than me, just a year older than you, and he's not sure what he's going to do.
Gideon sighed and rolled his right shoulder as if he'd hurt it recently.
He might stay on the ranch. There's room for another homestead. He might buy his own. He's not real keen on going to school.
So you're not really like your family either, she said. He came to the red light on the south end of town and turned to look at her.
I suppose so.
She smiled, and he returned the gesture, and the whole world could have wasted away and Penny wouldn't have known it. When Gideon looked at her, he was the only thing that mattered. He was the only thing she could focus on. Someone honked and Gideon flinched. He chuckled as he ducked his head and pressed on the accelerator to go through the light, which had turned green at some point. Heat moved through Penny, because when he looked at her, something obviously happened for him too, and she really liked that.
All right,
Gideon said as he turned into the parking lot at Miller's.
This looks fun.
An enormous tent had been set up in the back corner, and the moment Gideon opened his door, Penny heard guitars and drums. He came around and opened her door, and Penny slid to the pavement, immediately slipping her hand into his. Energy pulsed through the air, and Penny glanced around, trying to see everything at once. When Gideon leaned down and asked,
"It's going to be crowded tonight. You okay to stay?"
She felt alive in a brand new way. She'd be okay if she was with Gideon, no matter what happened or where they went or how many people pressed in around them. If she could hold Gideon's hand, she'd be just fine. Chapter 5. Gideon stepped into the homestead to find his mother pouring herself a glass of iced tea.
"Who's on the phone?" Gideon asked.
"I don't know," his mama said. "I didn't answer it. Spence did, but he went out to the front gate to meet the brick mason."
"Okay."
He moved over to the kitchen sink to wash his hands before he went into the hall to take the call. His brother had hollered to him from the back porch about the call, and Gideon had finished filling the trough for the goats before he'd come in.
"This is Gideon Walker,"
he said a few seconds later, cradling the phone between his arm and shoulder while he finished drying his hands.
"Mr. Walker,"
a man said.
"this is Emmett Hardgrove from IBM."
Gideon dropped the kitchen towel.
"Hi,"
he said.
"Hello. I'm reviewing your application, and I wondered if you had a few minutes to answer some questions."
"Yeah," Gideon said.
"Yes, of course."
His heart raced in his chest because out of the 4 companies he'd put in applications with, IBM was the biggest. They were the best. He wanted them the most. They definitely had the technology he wanted to work with. They'd made more advancements than anyone else in the past few years, and his skin itched to be buzzed through those doors and to be present in their meetings. He'd read everything he could get his hands on about the company, and they had manufacturing plants all over the world. They'd announced a new mainframe computer that could hold similar data in half the space. He'd heard rumblings of the company starting work on a line of personal computers after the departure of one of their best minds had left to start his own company. He wasn't even sure what questions Emmett asked or how he answered, but before he knew it, the interview ended. Gideon hung up, his mind whirring. He hadn't been offered a job, but as he forced himself to slow down, he could hear how smart he'd sounded. Emmett had said he'd call him the following day, and Gideon would probably be on a conference call with others in the company for a second interview.
A second interview.
A smile filled Gideon's whole soul, and he paused in the hallway and closed his eyes.
Dear Lord, if at all possible, I would love this job at IBM. "Gideon!"
Jonas barked, and Gideon ended the prayer there and stepped out of the hallway.
"Right here." "We've got goats all over the ranch. You didn't close the gate."
"Shoot," Gideon said.
"Sorry, I was in a hurry."
He jogged through the kitchen and back outside to find the goats all over the garden and backyard. They'd eat everything in a matter of minutes, and he had no idea how long he'd been on the phone.
"Sorry,"
he said again as Jonas joined him.
"Must have been a really important phone call,"
his brother grumbled. Gideon said nothing as he went with his brother to get some ropes out of the barn. Goats weren't nearly as stubborn as cattle, but it would be no picnic getting all these animals back where they belonged. Then he'd have to deal with his mother when she saw the state of her garden. As Gideon worked, he thought about Penny and how she'd react completely different about the phone call when he told her about it that night. He let his imagination run through an amazing scenario where she laughed and congratulated him as he held her in his arms. Then he could lean down and kiss her. The following evening, Gideon couldn't get to Penny's fast enough. The time since the interview had moved incredibly slowly, and he felt like his muscles had been hooked up to a powerful source of electricity. He went too fast down the dirt road toward the egg farm and Penny's house, but he couldn't slow down. The dust behind him kicked up into a thick cloud, and her family probably wouldn't like breathing it for the next half an hour until it settled. He forced himself to slow down as the big warehouse where Penny crated eggs came into view. He'd never been inside, but Penny had pointed it out to him on their second date. He'd had a third with her, too, and tonight was their fourth. He'd been nothing but the perfect Texas gentleman, but he really wanted to kiss Penny. Soon.
"You have to,"
he told himself.
"Everything is about to change, and she has to know how you feel."
He pulled into her driveway, pleased when she stood from where she'd been sitting on the front steps. Gideon barely had time to flip the truck into park before he flew from it.
"I got it,"
he called to her, already laughing.
"I got the job, Pen."
He jogged a few steps toward her, and she did the same to him until he swept her up into his arms, both of them laughing as he twirled her around. He set her on her feet and looked down at her, gallons upon gallons of happiness pouring through him.
I got the job at IBM.
She clasped her hands behind his neck and gazed up at him with that soft, sexy smile on her face that he really liked. Really, really liked. I knew you would, she said in that pretty little voice of hers. They'd be stupid not to hire you. Gideon just grinned because her confidence in him felt so good.
I think I might know what I want now,
he said. Oh, do tell, Penny said, dropping her hands from around his neck and taking one of his as she strolled back toward his truck. He squeezed her fingers.
I want to invent something big. I want to work in technology, with computers, with the space program, or the banking business. Did you read that article I left with you about the automated machines in England? The networks for banking are going to be huge, and we'll need security for all of that, and I want to do that. I want to learn about all of it and do something no one's ever done before.
He took a big breath and held it to calm himself down. At the same time, his determination and desire to be someone important and color outside the lines was a real driving force in his life, one he thought was good. Penny got in the truck while he held the door for her, and he stepped into the space between the door and the truck while she buckled her seatbelt.
And Pen, I want to be a father, too.
She clicked the belt into place and swung her attention toward him. Is that right?
Yeah,
he said, grinning. He closed the door, though she looked like she had something more to say. Once behind the wheel, he said,
Go on and ask.
Ask what?
You know what.
He flipped the truck into reverse and backed out of her driveway. How many kids do you want? She asked.
As many as the good Lord will give me, he said.
She giggled, and Gideon could only look at her. She wore her hair curled tonight, clipped back on the sides to reveal more of her gorgeous face. She wore makeup, but not so much that Gideon couldn't see her natural beauty. He'd learned a lot about her on their previous 3 dates, and he liked everything that came out of her mouth. He liked her parents, and he liked that she didn't mind working. It's going to take a lot of time to handle as many kids as God will give you, Penny said, something forced about her voice. How will you balance that and being the world's next great inventor? Gideon found his explanation fleeing. He had no idea because he didn't think about stuff like this. He didn't have to because he wasn't married. He didn't have a wife with a child on the way. He didn't even have a career yet.
I'll figure it out,
he said, because Gideon knew he could. He was smart, too, and he would find a way to juggle a wife, family, and a career in technology.
There is a little snag in all this good news.
He cleared his throat, and the mood in the cab changed instantly. What's that? She asked.
They want me there on the 28th.
Of July?
Yes,
he said. Gideon, she said, that's only 9 days from today.
Yeah,
he said.
I know.
He looked out his window and then back to the road in front of him.
I'm moving to Austin next weekend, Penny.
She didn't answer, and when he dared to look over to her, he found her with her arms folded, looking out her window. Are you breaking up with me then? She asked.
No,
he said quickly, surprised she'd even asked.
No, of course not.
He pulled over to the side of the road because this conversation required his full attention.
Penny,
he said gently.
Will you look at me, sweetheart?
She did, her eyes wide and worried. He liked that she was strong and smart and soft all at the same time.
I don't want to break up,
he said.
I'll only be in Austin for 3 weeks until you come. It's 3 weeks and I'll have a phone. We can call at night and there's no reason for us to break up when you'll be in Austin in only 3 weeks.
He gave her a small smile.
What do you think? Do you want to break up with me?
She shook her head. 3 weeks?
3 weeks,
he said.
And hey, we still have 9 more days before I have to go. Well, I'll move on Saturday, so I guess only 7 days.
1 week, It wasn't long enough, not for Gideon. As he gazed at Penny, he had the very real impression that 7 days with him wasn't long enough for Penny either. "My parents want you to come for dinner," Penny said, blinking and the vulnerability in her eyes disappearing. Now she wore a sparkle along with an edge of wariness. "Oh," he said. "Okay." He straightened and checked his rearview mirror. He eased back onto the highway and asked, "When?" "At your earliest convenience," she said. "That's actually what my father said." She giggled, and that eased some of Gideon's anxiety. He wasn't even sure what he was worried about. He'd met her parents before, both of them. Her mother a couple of times, and her father just the first time he'd gone to pick her up last week. "I'll come to dinner at the farmhouse," he said. "But you have to do something for me, too." "Is that right?" she teased. "And what would that be?" "Show me that duck pond you've been telling me about for a week." She burst out laughing, and Gideon joined in with her. They had fun together, and Gideon liked that. They'd talked about serious things, too, and he'd enjoyed those talks, too. Penny made him think, and he'd never met a woman who'd done that. He'd never met a woman like her at all. And though she was young, she seemed to have so much figured out. "I can show you the pond," she said. "You'll have to come a few minutes early." "Deal," he said. The conversation moved on to other things, his class schedule and who her roommates would be when she moved to Austin. But Gideon's thoughts revolved around how he could kiss her goodnight when he dropped her off after their date that evening. "Gideon Walker, you did not get us tickets to the Summer Square Dance Spectacular." Penny clapped her hand over her mouth and looked at him. "What?" he asked in mock sarcasm. "You don't want to go to this? Funny, I swear you mentioned it about 50 times after church on Sunday." He chuckled as she swatted at his chest. "I can't believe you," she said. "This has been sold out for months." She looked at him, searching his face. "How did you get tickets to this? And do not say you had to call in a favor." Gideon cocked his eyebrows at her and pulled into the parking space where the lot usher indicated he should. "I don't know what to say now." "How do you know so many people?" she asked. "My brother's girlfriend works for the county events office," he said. "They usually have extra tickets to things all over the county, and they sometimes get tickets for themselves that they don't use. I called her as soon as I got home after dropping you off on Sunday. She asked around the office, and she actually came up with 5 or 6 tickets that wouldn't be used." "This is unbelievable," Penny said as Gideon got out of the truck. She waited for him to open the door, and she stepped right into his arms. "Thank you, Gideon." She was sincere, and the world narrowed to just the two of them despite the crowd around them. Tonight she wore a yellow pair of pants, with a white, blue, red, and yellow striped sweater that hugged her arms to her elbows. She'd put a wide white belt around her waist, and Gideon felt like the luckiest man in the county to be with her. "Come on, sweetheart," he said, stepping back. He wanted to kiss her, but not here. Not in front of anyone and everyone streaming by. Not when he couldn't take his time and truly experience her. "Tonight we get to dance our cares away." Chapter 6. Penny reached up and pushed her hair off her sweaty forehead with the back of her hand. The eggs just kept coming, and she was tired. She'd promised her late nights with Gideon wouldn't interfere with her work, though, so she hadn't dared to even whisper a complaint. She got up on time. She came to the egg warehouse on time. She worked through the morning, no matter how hot it got in the warehouse. Today she was crating eggs into the dozen retail packages, and she did love the recyclable cartons that were made from grass. They usually made her smile, as did the multicolored eggs that came through the opening in the wall on the conveyor belt. She'd been crating eggs since the age of 7, and it wasn't particularly hard work. She remembered the anxiety when she'd first started, and how gingerly she'd touched the eggs. They were tougher than they looked, and it actually took a lot to break an egg with her bare hands. She really only ran into a problem when they fell on the floor. The tracks were in place, though, and it really was impossible for them to fall, unless she let them get so backed up that they pushed through the openings on the ends of the belt. She sometimes dropped them because she'd learned to pick up 3 eggs at a time and drop, 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 set them in the cartons. She finished the row of 5 she'd been working on, and her hands just knew what to do next. She flipped the tops over and secured them in place, then deftly stacked the cartons on top of one another. After pushing them into place against the others she'd already filled, Penny turned to get more cartons. 5 fit here, no matter how many times she'd tried to make 6 fit. She'd given up on trying to squeeze in an extra carton, because it always ended in disaster. She didn't particularly enjoy the retail dozen crating, because she had to inspect the eggs too. They were washed when they did retail crating, and sometimes the eggs were more slippery than normal. Sometimes she wore rubber gloves to give herself some grip, but today they'd only made her hands too sweaty inside the gloves, and she'd peeled them off after only 15 minutes. The eggs kept coming and coming, and Penny kept crating and crating. Because the work didn't require a lot of mental energy, her mind was free to think about Gideon. The man was absolutely maddening, and Penny sighed as she remembered the feather-light touch of his hands on her waist as they danced last night. He was maddening because he was good at everything he did. She had no idea a man his size could be so agile. And when she asked him where he'd learned to dance, he'd said his grandmother had taught him in the kitchen at the homestead. That only made him more endearing, and Penny had started to wonder if she had any endearing qualities. She knew she was pretty, but she wanted to be more than pretty. She knew she was smart, but honestly, most men didn't want a woman smarter than them. Gideon didn't seem to have a problem with it at all, and when she'd argued back with him about what she thought should happen with the county elections, he hadn't gotten his feelings hurt and shut the conversation down. He'd interacted with her like her opinions were important and valid. The conversation had been stimulating for her, and she hoped for him, too. "What else?" she asked herself, her voice barely loud enough to be heard over the low hum of the conveyor belt and the mechanical sounds that came from further in the warehouse. "There has to be more to you than a pretty face and quick wit." She could dance, too, and she did put together a good meal. She loved to sew, and she could see all the straight lines and hems of a garment before she even started. "So you have some skills," she thought, finally leaving that topic behind. Gideon was strong. He worked hard around his family's ranch. He'd already earned 1 degree, and he'd gotten a job at IBM. Every time he showed up at her house, he was clean-cut, polished, and polite. He definitely had all the right pieces in all the right places. And yet, he was utterly maddening because he hadn't kissed her when he'd dropped her off last night. True, Darren had just arrived back at the farmhouse, too, and he'd walked with the 2 of them up the sidewalk to the porch. But Gideon hadn't even climbed the steps. Darren had, and he'd gone inside, leaving Penny and Gideon alone. The porch light had haloed the 2 of them, and under the starry Texas sky, the desire to kiss him had reached a new level. He'd said, "Thanks for a great night, Pen. I'll call you tomorrow." He'd hugged her quickly, whispering, "I don't want your brother to watch our first kiss. Tomorrow?" before stepping back. What was she supposed to say to that? She'd just nodded and gone up the steps and into the house. Darren was loitering in the sitting room, and Penny had swatted him with both hands. "You ruined it," she'd hissed to keep her voice low. She didn't need to wake her parents over a kiss she still hadn't gotten. "Why couldn't you have been 5 minutes earlier, or 5 minutes later?" Darren had shrunk back and held up his arms, though she wasn't hitting him hard enough to even hurt. He chuckled, actually chuckled, and said, "If I was 5 minutes later, I'd have totally interrupted you kissing him." Penny stood back, searching his face. "What?" "Oh, Pen," Darren said, smiling for all he was worth. "That man is smitten with you.
When he kisses you, it's not going to be a quick thing."
Penny hadn't known what to say to that. She was already late coming home, and she'd laid in bed for at least an hour, thinking about the kiss she'd hoped and prayed for that she hadn't quite gotten yet. Tomorrow night, she vowed as she filled the 5th egg carton. Lids closed, cartons stacked and moved out of the way. More cartons laid out. She was going to kiss him tomorrow night when he came for dinner at the farmhouse. She'd spoken briefly with her mother that morning, and they'd agreed on dinner then. Later today, Penny would see Gideon after church, and she hoped he'd invite her to the potluck picnic that followed the sermon. If he didn't, she was planning to invite him. She couldn't kiss him in front of all the little old ladies at the potluck, though, and if she snuck off with the man, her brothers would tease her relentlessly. She wasn't sure why she cared what they thought of her. She knew Gideon was far different than anyone else she'd ever dated, and that turned her thoughts to the future. As a little girl, she'd fantasized about 3 things: the day she passed the state bar and became a lawyer, her wedding day, and becoming a mother. Though she'd only just begun a relationship with Gideon, it already felt serious to her. All of a sudden, she wasn't sure how to be all of the things she'd always wanted to be. Did women raise a family and practice law at the same time? Which did she want more? And was she willing to give up one for the other? New fantasies had started to bloom in her mind, and they all featured dark-haired, dark-eyed boys and girls, spitting images of Gideon, with his quick smile and loud laugh. "He won't even kiss you," she said, frustration building in her chest again. Having his children seemed so far away, and yet her mind had started to revolve around what her future actually held. The door opened and Penny looked up as Andrew came in with a couple of other workers.
"Almost done," he said. "How many have we got?"
500, Penny said. She'd been crating so long she had a feel for what she'd done. That, and she grouped the cartons in stacks of 5 and rows of 20. The table had been marked with tape for this purpose exactly, and she'd just finished her 5th section. "They're still coming."
"We just finished the washing,"
he said, pulling a cart over to the long steel table where she crated.
"They'll be done in 10 minutes.
He started loading the cartons onto the cart, as did Philip and Luke. They loaded the carton so much faster than she'd been able to do herself, and it was almost disheartening to see an entire morning's worth of work get taken so quickly. Andrew started cleaning up, while Philip and Luke took the cart out to the van. They'd deliver the eggs that afternoon, and they'd be in the refrigerated cases in the stores by that evening. Penny did enjoy seeing her family's eggs in the grocery store, though she never bought eggs. They had plenty of fresh eggs whenever they wanted them. She'd begged her mother not to do an egg dish for tomorrow night's dinner, and her mom said she'd look through her recipes. The eggs finally stopped, and Penny finished with 3 eggs in one of the cartons. She took them back out because they didn't waste cartons, and they didn't sell partials. She'd take these back to the house, where she'd have to rush to get ready for church. "Thanks for helping clean up," she said to Andrew, who just nodded. They walked back to the farmhouse together, and Penny wondered why he was so quiet. As they went down the slight rise, she asked, "Are you okay, Andy?"
"I need your help,"
he said, slowing his step until he stopped. Penny did the same, passing him one of the eggs to carry.
"I want to talk to Dad about going to school."
Penny wasn't sure what she'd expected her brother to say. Maybe that he'd met a girl and wanted help asking her out. But it wasn't that. "Oh," she said. "Why are you asking me?"
"Because you're the only one of us who's gone to college."
Andy looked at her then, and she saw the unrest in her brother's soul.
"I want to study accounting and run the financial side of the egg farm."
"I thought you wanted to go to truck driving school."
"I don't want to be on the road my whole life,"
he said, toeing the ground with his boot.
"See, I met this girl, and she's making me rethink things."
"A girl?" Penny asked, linking her arm through Andy's. "We have to go, or Mama will be out here yelling at us to hurry up. Church starts in less than an hour." She deliberately didn't ask who he'd met because Andy would usually tell without being asked if left alone.
Yeah,
Andy said.
and I know I'm not as smart as you, but I've always liked math, and I think I could earn a certificate or something to be able to keep working the farm. I don't want to give that up, but not have to be on the road for 9 months out of the year.
You're plenty smart, she said. You do great at college. They went up the front steps together, and Penny paused, despite the risk of incurring her mother's wrath. You just go up to Daddy and you say, Daddy, I've been thinking and I've found this great accounting program. You have to find the program first, Andy. Do the research. I can help you before I go back to Austin.
Okay,
He said.
I don't think I can leave Sweet Creek. There have to be things closer around here.
I'm sure there are, she said. We'll find out. Anyway, then you tell him what you want to do. And here's the key, Andy. You ask him what he thinks. Ask him for his advice. Daddy loves to give advice, and honestly, he's not wrong very often. Andrew nodded and reached to open the door with the words,
Thanks, Pen. Can we start looking around this week?
She hadn't told anyone but her mother that Gideon was leaving town on Saturday, and she opened her mouth to say she might be busy, as she wanted to spend every spare moment with him before he left, but her mother yanked open the door. Her bright green eyes blazed with unhappy fire. There you two are. We have to leave in 20 minutes. You know better than to dawdle on the Sabbath.
Sorry, Mama,
Andrew mumbled as he stepped past her. Penny simply smiled at her mom and asked, What did you decide on for dinner tomorrow night?
Oh, do you think about anything but that boy?
Mama asked, shooing Penny into the house. Penny only giggled because she knew her mother liked Gideon Walker a whole lot. Not as much as Penny, but a whole lot. And she'd definitely make a spectacular dinner for that boy. Penny sat on the front steps, looking down the road despite the fact that she heard nothing. Gideon was late. Her left leg bounced as she tried to get her nerves out before he got there, if he was even coming. With every minute that passed, she saw her opportunity to take him down to the duck pond and kiss him shrink right before her eyes. Just then, the familiar rumble of an engine filled the air, and in the next moment, Gideon's dirty white truck came into view. By the time he pulled into her driveway, Penny stood at the end of the sidewalk, every nerve ending buzzing with excitement.
I'm so sorry,
he said as he got out of the truck. She met him at the front of it, no way to smother her smile. He drew her into his embrace as he explained further.
I got into it with Jonas, and my father doesn't let us just walk away angry.
He pulled back and sighed.
So we had to have this talk, and...
His voice trailed off as he shook his head.
It's fine. I'm here.
He met her eyes.
Do we still have time to see the pond?
Let me check with my mom real quick, okay? She darted into the garage and went up the steps. She walked past the laundry room, the scent of cooking beef filling her nose. Mama, Gideon just got here and I want to show him the duck pond. Are we okay to head over there for a bit? Her mother looked over her shoulder.
That's fine, dear.
She smiled at Penny.
Daddy just radioed in to say he needs a few extra minutes, so there's time.
Relief filled Penny, and she nodded. She hurried across the kitchen and kissed her mom's cheek. I think he's finally going to kiss me, Mama. Her mother laughed lightly and said,
Be gentle with him, Pen.
I will, Penny promised, and she hurried back outside to Gideon. We're good for a bit, she said. Daddy said he needs a few extra minutes out with the chickens.
Great.
Gideon laced his fingers through hers, and they started up the road. About halfway to the egg warehouse, she deviated off the road and down a path that was barely noticeable. I love coming here, Penny said, letting go of his hand so she could walk ahead of him. The path was only wide enough for one, and Penny's soul quieted as the pond expanded before her.
Why?
Gideon asked.
What's special about it?
Penny paused on the path to take in the trees, the lush green grass, and the still water. A duck even quacked in the silence. It's just so peaceful, she said. Whenever I'm not sure what to do, I come here because it's easy to think." She continued down the path, wishing she had more time to sit on the bench beside the pond and do exactly what she'd just said. Think. She needed some clarity of mind as she started to think about what her future truly held for her. She reached the bottom of the path, and Gideon stepped beside her. "I feel like I've gotten a lot of answers here." She took a deep breath and looked at him. "It's beautiful," he said, still surveying the pond. "I came here when my grandmother died, and I came when I was trying to decide where to go to school. The duck pond never lets me down." She hoped the magic and charm of it would earn her a kiss today. Gideon looked at her, and they seemed to be of one mind. He took her into his arms, and she ran her hands up his arms to his face. "I sure do like you, Penny," he said, his voice as quiet and peaceful as the duck pond. "I sure like you too," she whispered. "If you don't kiss me right now, I might go crazy." He chuckled and ducked his head, causing the brim of his cowboy hat to bump her forehead. He swept the hat off his head, and Penny let her eyes drift closed. Her pulse raced in anticipation, and she drew in a breath that held the uniquely masculine scent of Gideon. Leather and cotton and soap and spicy musk. His lips touched hers, and while he wasn't the first boy Penny had kissed, he was definitely the first man. She cradled his face in her hands as he slowly kissed her, then moved her fingers into his hair as she matched his movement. She didn't want to be gentle. She wanted him to know how much she liked him and how much she didn't want him to leave on Saturday. By the time he pulled away, Penny had lost all track of time. The world swayed behind her closed eyes, and she tucked herself against his chest so she could feel his heartbeat. Everything in her life shifted again, because she now knew she wanted Gideon Walker to be part of her future. And that meant other pieces had to be shifted around. After a few more minutes, Penny said, "We better get back to the farmhouse." "All right," he said. "Just one more thing." Then he kissed her again, and Penny melted right into his touch as he embedded himself in her heart. Chapter 7. Gideon hadn't kissed a woman in a long time, but thankfully he still knew how to do it. At least Penny seemed to like it. His stomach still clenched with nerves because he'd only gotten one thing out of the way: kissing Penny. Now he had to go to dinner with her family. His argument with Jonas lingered in the back of his mind, and he wished he'd been able to control his tongue and his temper. He didn't need that added stress in his life right now. But he honestly didn't care if Jonas needed to hire someone for the ranch sooner than he'd expected. It was his ranch, and he had to shoulder the responsibility for it. His father hadn't been happy with Gideon's argument either, but what did they expect? "You gave him the ranch," Gideon had said, his voice too loud. "What do you want from me? My blood, sweat, and tears until the day I die? This isn't my ranch, as you've both made very clear. This isn't my responsibility, and I'm not going to feel guilty because I have to go to Austin to start a job with literally the best technology firm in the state. I'm not." He'd tried to leave then, but his mother had given him a cocked eyebrow look that said, "Sit down, Gideon." So he'd sat back down. He put the conversation out of his mind and focused on the feel of Penny's hand in his. "They're going to like me, right?" he asked, usually not so nervous when he was with Penny. But he hadn't met a woman's parents before, and while Penny's mother was nice, her father had definitely sized up Gideon every time he looked at him. "Of course they are," Penny said, nudging him with her shoulder. "Don't tell me you're seriously worried about it." "I'm definitely worried about it." Gideon gazed out over the fields surrounding the buildings they were passing. "Is this where your chickens live?" "That's right," she said. "We have 30,000 layer hens, not chickens." "Holy cow," he said. "How many do you feed?" "I only have to do building 6, she said. "It takes about an hour in the evening. You can come help me tonight." She grinned up at him and giggled. "Isn't this the most romantic date you've ever been on? Dinner with your girlfriend's parents and feeding chickens." She laughed, and Gideon could smile with her. If he was with Penny, he didn't much care what they did. "We have all this land, too," Penny said, "because we have to let our hens out during the day. They're free range."
"And you gather them all up at night?"
"Birds like to roost at night," she said. "They come in themselves, and Brandon rides around on an ATV and gathers up the stragglers. They get fed, and in the morning we gather their eggs. And we have a crew who gathers in the afternoon, too. Hens don't really care what our schedule is."
"I bet they don't."
Gideon's stomach swooped as the farmhouse came into view. He took in a deep breath and tried to tell himself that he'd be fine. Penny would be there, and surely her father and brothers wouldn't fire questions at him that he couldn't answer. "My father loves talking mechanical stuff," Penny said. "And you can't go wrong with my mom if you compliment her cooking."
"Mechanical stuff,"
Gideon said.
"Does that extend to technology?"
Penny peeled out a string of laughter. "No, sir, it does not." She looked up at him. "My dad is awesome. Great. But he's literally worked on this egg farm since he was 6 years old. He's smart, and he's made some great improvements around here. His main goal is to make sure this place can continue into the future for his sons."
"Got it,"
Gideon said, his mind moving through the things she'd told him. Before he knew it, Penny was leading him up the steps to the deck attached to the back of the house, and then she opened the door. Cool air met them, and Gideon started to relax a little bit. "There they are," her mother said, her voice falsely bright. Penny's hand in his tightened, and he stepped to her side. All three of her brothers stopped what they were doing and looked at him. Gideon worked not to clear his throat or shift his feet. Darren set down the fork in his hand and straightened, but Gideon was still a couple of inches taller than him. They all sported hair in various shades of brown, with plenty of that auburn mixed in that Penny had, too. Her mother came around the counter and said, "Stop staring at him." "My brothers," Penny blurted as if her mother's voice had thawed something inside her. "Darren's the oldest." She nodded to him. "I think you've met him before."
"Sure have,"
Gideon said, putting a smile on his face as he stepped forward to shake her brother's hand.
"And you must be Brandon,"
he added, glancing at Penny, who loitered near the door watching him.
"And the youngest is Andrew." "Penny's the youngest,"
Darren said. "The youngest boy, he meant," Penny said with a bit of bite in her voice. Gideon shook all of their hands, glad when they smiled back at him, and gripped his fingers with strength. "My mother," Penny said. "You've met, but formally. This is Jean. Where's Daddy?"
Her mother started. "Right here," her father said,
and Gideon turned toward the sound of his voice. He came out of the doorway, and he alone had purely brown hair and dark eyes. The boys had a mix of hazel and green eyes, and Penny was the only one with the bright pair her mother had. "My father," Penny said, "Jason Aarons. Daddy, Mama, this is Gideon Walker."
"I think I've heard that name before,"
Jason said, and Gideon chuckled.
"Penny doesn't usually hold a whole lot back, in case you haven't figured that out."
"Daddy," Penny said, "you said you wouldn't embarrass me."
"At least we like this one,"
Darren said.
"Darren,"
Penny hissed. "Let's sit down," Jean chirped. "Boys, behave." Shuffling and the scraping of chairs, and Gideon sat beside Penny while the brothers took up places across from them. Her father settled at one end of the table, and her mom turned back to the kitchen.
"I'm just saying,"
Brandon said.
"Gideon seems normal. Remember that one guy who didn't know Mississippi was a state?"
"Are you really going to do this?" Penny asked as her brothers twittered with laughter. "Because if I recall, Brandon, you went out with that girl from—"
"Stop it,"
Brandon said, not laughing anymore. He glanced at his father and back to Penny, the message clear. "I'm just saying," she said. "I know plenty about you, too." She glared at him and then switched her gaze to Darren. I could say plenty about you, too.
Hey,
he protested.
I said I liked him. I like him too,
Andrew said quickly, and Gideon wondered what dirt Penny had on him. Her mother set a pot roast on the table, complete with carrots and potatoes in the stock. Gideon's mouth watered and he smiled at her mom.
This looks amazing, ma'am.
I just need to get the butter out of the microwave oven. She hurried away and Gideon swung his attention after her.
You have a microwave oven?
He half rose from his seat, bumping the table. Heat filled his face, but he couldn't stop himself. He straightened fully as he watched her mom open the microwave oven that sat right there on the counter. How he hadn't seen it escaped him, but he could now.
Did you guys see the demos they did at Fisher's?
He asked.
Is that where you got it?
In that moment, he realized that everyone was staring at him.
I mean, I wanted my mother to get one, but she's not a fan.
Gideon likes technology, Penny said.
Yes,
her father said.
He's got a job at IBM.
Gideon swung his attention to Jason, and he caught the smile on his face before it slid away. He sat down and glanced at Darren, who simply looked back at him. Okay, Jean said, returning to the table. She set a bowl of mostly melted butter in the middle of it. I'm still figuring it out. She sat down, the tension in the room now as thick as breathing through cotton. Gideon started chuckling, the sound low in his throat but gaining strength and volume. Jason joined in, and that somehow gave everyone at the table permission to laugh too, even Jean. Stop it, she said between her giggles, but she beamed at Gideon like he was her personal savior. Everything after that was easy, and Gideon enjoyed himself, and the food, and the company he was with a whole lot. He'd kissed the woman, and he liked her family. After they fed the chickens, layer hens, and after he'd kissed her goodbye and driven away, Gideon wondered why he was moving to Austin this weekend. Penny obviously had plenty of male admirers, and maybe she'd meet someone more interesting than him in the 3 weeks it took for her to follow him to school. He lifted the last box into the back of his truck and turned back to Mac and Moose. The dog sat on the porch and gazed down at him, clearly not happy that he was leaving.
I have to go, guys,
he said, climbing the steps. He pushed Mac over and sat between them.
Daddy's still going to be here, and he's your real master.
Moose laid his head down in Gideon's lap, and he absently stroked the dog's head. His father had helped with the first few boxes, but there was work to do around the ranch every day of the week, even Saturday, and his father didn't like goodbyes, so he'd made an excuse about being needed in the stable, hugged Gideon, and left. Jonas hadn't stuck around to help that morning, and Gideon wasn't surprised. He'd barely said 2 words to his brother since the argument on Monday night. Spencer had been working until Gideon said, "There's only one left, and I can get it." He'd gone back inside with Gideon, but he'd gone into the kitchen while Gideon had gone back to his bedroom. The front door opened behind him, and Gideon twisted to see his mother exiting the house. She groaned as she towed Mac out of the way and sat on the step beside him. She patted Gideon's knee and said, "You've got everything?"
"Yes, ma'am."
"Why are you still sitting on the porch?" Gideon smiled at her.
"I don't know. Maybe I was hoping my mama would pack me a lunch so I wouldn't starve on moving day."
She laughed as she shook her head, and Gideon chuckled with her. "There's food inside, baby," she said. "All yous need to do is come get it." She stood up, while Gideon grinned at the plural use of you. Jonas talked the same way, and it did endear them to Gideon. He followed her inside, picked up the brown paper bag she'd filled with food, and turned to hug her.
"I love you, Mama."
"I love you too, Gideon." She stretched up to hold him, and he thought he'd never be too old to get a hug from his mother. "You be a good boy in Austin, okay?"
"Okay, Mama."
He was tired of telling her he wasn't a boy anymore. To her, he'd always be her boy.
"I can call you tonight."
"Of course, baby," she said. "Call and tell me how the house is."
"I will."
Gideon left then, because if he didn't think he'd go at all. Driving away from the ranch was easy. Leaving Sweet Creek when Penny was still here was much harder than Gideon anticipated. His nerves followed him all the way to Austin because he'd rented a little house over the phone, sight unseen. He drove around in circles for a few minutes, but when he finally pulled up to the house, he was pleasantly surprised. The lawn was green and trimmed. The white siding on the house was actually white, and the driveway didn't hold any weeds. "Thank you, Lord," he whispered to the windshield. He had so much to be grateful for. And Gideon bowed his head and said a prayer of gratitude before he got out of the truck to go see where he'd be living for the foreseeable future. Chapter 8. Penny giggled, wishing she could get further from the kitchen. Her parents both sat at the dining room table, the ledgers where they kept their finances for the farm spread in front of them. They did this once a month, and Penny had made double chocolate brownies for the occasion. They pored over the books for 2 or 3 nights, entering receipts and logging deposits. Every time they did, Penny was reminded of how much her mother and father loved one another, and that always warmed her heart. Gideon's voice on the other end of the phone line helped with that, too.
"So you'll be living with a couple of other girls?"
he asked. He'd called every night since he'd left Sweet Creek, and Penny liked that he operated like clockwork. "Yes," she said, keeping her voice low. He'd told her about the job, and his voice always grew in volume and excitement when he detailed his desk at IBM and talked about his boss and the technology he was learning about. Oh, the technology. Microchips that were shrinking but holding more data. Personal computers, which Gideon was convinced would be in homes one day. She couldn't imagine such a thing. Her mother could barely get the microwave oven to work. How would someone like her use a computer? Besides, computers were bulky and filled entire rooms. Penny had marveled at the things Gideon had said about using the machines for the space program, for banking, for travel, for literally everything.
"I'm telling you, Pen," he'd said, "this is going to be huge, and I can't wait for my chance to do something that will change the world."
He spoke about credit cards and bank cards and the need to ensure encryption and security for people as they started shopping with plastic. He told her about Intel, a company that was preparing to announce something huge in the industry, and how he was right there watching it all happen. The man loved technology, and he thought in ways Penny couldn't comprehend. She adored the way he was passionate about something, and she had the very real feeling that if their relationship succeeded and she married him, she'd never live a boring life. She wanted that with everything inside her. She loved her family and the egg farm, but she was a lot like Gideon in that she wanted more. She wanted to see and experience everything, and she knew Gideon did too.
"Who are they?"
he asked, and Penny blinked to get herself back in the moment. "There will be 4 of us," she said. "Last year I lived with Hannah and Cheryl. We got along really great, so in the spring we signed a contract for this apartment fairly close to campus. I'll share a room with Hannah."
"I can't wait to meet them,"
he said, and he wasn't lying. Gideon liked everyone he met, which was also something Penny liked about him. She pressed her back into the wall in the hall, the phone cord stretched as far as she could get it. The constant tension made her arm ache, but she still sighed happily. "We thought it would be just the 3 of us, but then we got a letter a couple of weeks ago that a woman named Giselle will be in the apartment too. I don't know her."
"Hopefully she'll get along with the 3 of you,"
Gideon said. He yawned, and Penny took that as a cue that he needed to go. "I'll let you go," she said. "You sound tired."
"No,"
he said.
"Don't go. I'm fine."
Penny closed her eyes and leaned her head back against the wall. "Don't go." He sounded somewhat desperate to keep her on the line, though they'd been talking for an hour. "My mother is going to come around the corner at any moment and make me get off the phone anyway," Penny whispered.
"I want every second then,"
Gideon said, his voice almost as soft, though he lived alone in a real house, in a real neighborhood, much farther from campus than Penny would. He had a vehicle, though, and only planned on going to campus 2 days a week. She'd take her bicycle and ride the bus everywhere.
Tell me about the chickens,
he said. She smiled, feeling herself sink further in love with this man. She wasn't sure what exactly it was about him, though he did exhibit kindness and genuine interest in her and what she was interested in. Perhaps that was it. He wasn't constantly talking about himself and how amazing he was, but he asked her about her life, too.
The chickens are boring,
she said.
Tell me what you're worried about, then.
She opened her eyes, wondering how he'd known some of her doubts had been crowding back inside her mind.
I've got this advanced chemistry class this semester,
she said. I'm worried about that.
You don't have to earn a degree in chemistry to go to law school,
Gideon said.
You could switch to history, Pen. Or English. You might like that better.
I might, she conceded. But, Gideon, I want... She didn't know how to say it without sounding too full of herself.
You want to be the best,
he said for her. She couldn't deny it, so she stayed silent.
You want to change the world,
he said with a light laugh that made her heart ache. She wanted to be with him so badly, and she had no idea how she was going to survive the next 2 weeks.
I think that's you, Mr. Walker,
she teased. If she didn't turn this moment light, she feared she might cry, and she would not waste 1 second of her phone call with Gideon crying. What with your talk of cyber something and fiber optics and micro-processing. He burst out laughing, and the simple sound of that filled her spirit to the brim. When she missed him this week, she could remember this laugh and she'd be okay.
It's a microprocessor, Pen,
he said, still chuckling. Gideon, I miss you, Penny said, and he stopped laughing.
I miss you too, sweetheart,
he said.
No one's asked you out while I've been gone, right?
She giggled again, because it was cute how much he wanted her to himself. No, sir, she said. I haven't even left the farm.
That's good,
he said.
I've been thinking, Pen.
Sounds dangerous, she teased. Gideon remained silent, and Penny regretted that she hadn't just let him speak. Go on, she said.
I'm trying to find the right order for the words.
Penny's heartbeat sped. What's it about?
Us,
he said. What about us? She stretched her legs out in front of her to get some relief in her tailbone. Everything was starting to go numb, and she'd need to stand up soon.
I've just been thinking about things,
he said,
and how I'm going to balance it all.
Your classes and work?
Yes, that,
he said.
But farther down the road than that, sweetheart. I've only ever known ranch life. My dad worked all the time, literally all the time. He still does. Jonas does. Your father does too. How did they have families and faith and, I don't know, just do everything?
I don't know.
Remember how you asked me what I wanted?
Yes.
I want to do what's right,
he said.
I want to be a good father and a good husband, but I don't know what either of those really mean. What makes a good dad, you know? How can I be a good husband?
He paused for a moment.
And yes, I want to change the world. I want to be right there on the edge of everything new in the world, and a fear that might take me from my wife and family.
Penny let his words sink into her ears and mind. It's about choices, Gideon, she said. You have to prioritize things, that's all.
A man needs to make a living for his family,
he argued back, though his voice was soft.
That requires him to be gone, a lot. Does that make him a bad father? A negligent husband?
Of course not, Penny said. You'll... Penny, her mother said. Time to get off the phone. She glanced up at her mom and nodded. She got to her feet as she said, My mom wants me to get off, Gideon. She took a step toward her mom and then turned her back on her. Listen, you'll figure it out, just like you figured out everything in your life so far.
I'm afraid to fail,
he said.
I'm afraid to fail you, and I'm afraid to fail me, and I'm afraid to fail us.
He was a beautiful, beautiful man, and Penny smiled at the floor for some reason. Right now, you're not failing me or you or us, so try to get some sleep tonight and call me after church tomorrow. We'll go over your plan to wow Justin on Monday with your amazing ideas. That got him to chuckle, and Penny was glad she could end the conversation on a more positive note.
I sure do like you, Penny Aarons,
he said.
I'll talk to you tomorrow.
Bye, Gideon. Penny turned and sighed as she walked over to the cradle and hung up the phone. Her mother stood there, concern etched in every line of her face.
How's Gideon?
Amazing, Penny said, stepping into her mother's arms. I like him so much, Mom. She pulled back and looked at her mother. I'm falling in love with him. Is it crazy?
Of course not, her mother said.
He's a fine young man. I'm 19, Penny whispered, pressing her cheek to her mother's shoulder. I have years to go before law school and then years of that. What if... Sometimes plans change, Pen, her mom said gently. There's no sense in worrying about what if. Now, go on and get to bed. You have to crate the 5 dozen packages in the morning, and I won't let you skip church. She stroked Penny's hair, a song starting in her chest. Penny stayed within the circle of her mother's arms as she hummed the childhood lullaby, and then she straightened. Love you, Mom. I love you too, Penny. She tucked her hair behind her ear, such love on her face. You'll make the right decision with Gideon. You're smart, and so is he. Penny nodded and moved around the corner and up the steps to her bedroom. Pure exhaustion filled her, and after she'd changed into her pajamas and brushed her teeth, she knelt beside her bed and begged the Lord to guide her when it came to Gideon. Once under the covers, Penny closed her eyes and tried to go to sleep, but the words, family or career, looped through her mind on repeat. She wanted both. She always had. The real question was, would she be willing to give up Gideon to be a lawyer? Chapter 9. Gideon sat in his chair and listened to Justin talk about Intel's 4004 microprocessor. He could barely understand the concept, but Justin held the calculator in his hand.
It's brand new, he said, and they designed this chip as a central processing unit. It's incredible. It's going to change things.
He didn't look happy about that, though Gideon bordered on thrilled.
Word is that Texas Instruments is going to be releasing a new model in the fall, too.
Justin continued, stepping over to Gideon's desk and putting down the calculator. He continued to detail what the other companies were doing, and then he asked,
What can IBM do to compete?
I'm not sure why we even need to,
Thomas said from Gideon's right.
Our line of office products isn't where IBM makes its money.
He glanced around at the other 4 men gathered in the conference room.
Right? What am I missing?
It's brand new technology,
Reed said.
That's what you're missing. It's about more than calculators.
So you're saying we need a microprocessor too? We have thousands of clients around the world with the 370, and our software department can't keep up.
Thomas frowned.
I'm not sure we're going to enter the market with a calculator that's going to drive us forward.
Gideon listened to them all talk. He listened to the ideas being offered, his mind whirring through how he could contribute. In the next lull, he said,
IBM needs to consider the possibility of going small.
Justin turned toward him, and even Reed, the most senior product development engineer, did as well.
What do you mean?
I mean,
Gideon said slowly, his synapses firing now.
This is a microprocessor. It's small. People like small things. They like things that fit in their homes or the palm of their hand. Look at televisions. They're getting smaller and smaller as we find ways to improve the components.
He reached for the calculator.
Look at this model. It's 15% smaller than the last one. Everything costs less when it's not as bulky.
He turned to Thomas.
Thomas is right that IBM is leading the industry for business computers, but they're big and bulky, and companies need entire rooms to house them. We dominate there, and no one's arguing that. Our corporate lawyers are actually trying to argue that,
Justin said.
but I know what you're saying.
Gideon nodded because, yes, IBM had been accused of attempting to monopolize the market for business computing.
What I'm trying to say is we shouldn't be trying to design our own microprocessor. We should be meeting with Intel to partner with them. We should be thinking beyond the calculator. To what?
Reed asked.
A personal computer?
Exactly, Gideon said, seeing a vision in his mind that had a computer in every home in America.
A personal computer. A small version of what we use here to run things. Men and women would use them for personal things. What exactly?
Justin challenged. Gideon sat back, his brain buzzing.
Well, for one, the possibilities are endless. But for an example, take anyone who has to deal with finances to run their business. We do, and we have a machine to help us with the math, just like NASA does. On a personal level, my father could use a personal computer to keep his books. No more ledgers, no more paper receipts. And you pair this with the magnetic strip technology IBM has, and you've offered ranchers and farmers across the country a faster, easier way to do their books.
Gideon looked around at everyone.
They do it right from their homes on their personal computer. That's insane,
Marcus said.
Can you imagine how much that would cost for a family? Farmers and ranchers can't afford that.
Gideon just looked at him.
The more advancements we have, the cheaper it will all be to produce.
Justin sat down, a thoughtful look on his face.
The corner store owner could use the machine for transactions,
Gideon offered.
We offer retail establishments the Stripe capability, and they go from handwriting receipts and counting money at the end of every day to printing a record and having the computer keep track of the math for them. You're talking about a simple adding machine,
Reed said.
That's exactly what we already have. Adding machines, calculators. This is office product talk.
Sure, Gideon said.
But it's not an adding machine. It's a computer. It doesn't just spit out a number at the end. It's a complex system that we can program to do whatever we want. Not only that,
Gideon said, about to reveal his real passion,
but IBM is going to need a whole new department for the security of these computers. Systems can be hacked. We saw that with AT&T and John Draper. We'd be absolutely blind if we didn't start thinking about and developing security for our machines.
Gideon's excitement leveled up.
Remember the MIT students?
Reed and Thomas simply looked at him blankly.
Yes,
Justin said.
The Unix thing.
Right, Marcus said. They rewrote the code and it was actually better than what they started with.
They're hacking systems,
Gideon said.
The phone lines are just systems. Computers are just systems. And we're going to need a department dedicated to preventing that on our machines. Our customers will buy it because they want their systems to be safe.
He looked around at everyone.
So we shouldn't be thinking office products or sending a memo to development. We should be thinking bigger, by thinking small. IBM is poised here, gentlemen, to take computers to the masses.
The silence in the room filled him with joy, and Gideon couldn't wait to get home that night and call Penny. He waited for the protests to come, but no one said anything. Finally, Justin stood up and buttoned his suit coat.
Gideon, what do we do next? We call Intel, and we start talking to them about the 4004. We should be thinking of partnering with them, not competing with them. At least in the beginning,
Marcus said.
Right,
Reed said.
Then we could see what they're doing and get our engineers in the labs too. The market is wide open for this,
Gideon said, almost to himself.
This is only the beginning. You're with me this week, Gideon,
Justin said.
Let's meet tomorrow and see if we can get the chip out of this calculator.
He turned toward Reed.
Who do we know at Intel? Will they talk to us? I'll call my guy,
Reed said, standing up.
I have another meeting.
Me too, Justin said.
9 tomorrow, Gideon? I'll be there.
He stood with the others and left the conference room. Instead of going back to his desk, he went all the way downstairs and outside, unable to be contained by walls right now. His happiness morphed to joy and excitement, and he paused by the fountain in the courtyard and closed his eyes.
Thank you, thank you, thank you,
he thought, praising the Lord for his good performance in his meeting today.
That sounds terrible,
Gideon said, smiling despite Penny's story about the sprinkler that had broken, causing a muddy, filthy mess in one of their free-range hen fields. I was covered, Penny said. I think I still have some mud under my nails. She didn't sound happy about it either. She sighed while he chuckled. What are you doing tomorrow? She asked, changing the subject. I bet you can guess what I'll be doing. He loved her dry, sarcastic tone, and he looked up from the 2 dogs at his feet. The front yard at the ranch stretched before him, and it took every ounce of willpower he had not to get behind the wheel of his truck again and go see her right now. Darkness had already started to fall, though, and he'd only get an hour with her at the most. Not only that, but he'd planned a surprise visit in the morning, and he didn't want to ruin that. I don't know, he said, and at least that was the truth.
Probably go to the park or something. Rent a canoe.
That sounds fun, she said. I'm going to. Wait for it. Crate eggs. She laughed afterward, but Gideon got the feeling she was ready to be done in the egg warehouse. He laughed with her and reached down to pat Moose.
I've got to get to the bookstore and get my books, too,
he said. Wait, she said. I thought we were going to do that together when I get there next weekend. Gideon's grin could have lit the entire state of Texas.
Oh, right, I forgot about that.
So don't go without me, she said. I'm making my father leave here at 8:30 on Saturday morning, she said. I'll get unpacked and I'll meet you for lunch.
I can't wait,
he said, his voice sticking in his throat. Me either, she said. Only 8 more days. Gideon hoped they'd always count down the days until they could see one another again.
I should go,
he said.
It's getting late, and it's been a busy week for me.
It sure has, Mr. Big Shot at IBM. Gideon laughed again, shaking his head.
I'm not a big shot.
He had been to plenty of conferences with the upper-level management at IBM that week, and he, Reed, and Justin had started talking to Intel.
But I sure do like you, Penny Aarons.
I sure do like you too, Gideon Walker, she said, and the call ended. He lowered the phone from his ear, glad his mother had put one on the front table by the front door. He looked at it, thinking it sure would be nice if this thing didn't have a cord. Then he could take it anywhere he wanted. His mind started to whir again, but he got up and put the phone back in the cradle.
Gideon, do you have a second?
He turned at the sound of his father's voice, a tremor of trepidation tripping through him.
Sure, Dad,
he said. He followed his dad back into the kitchen, where his mother sat at the dining room table, a cup of steaming tea in front of her. How she drank that in the height of the Texas summer, Gideon would never understand. His father sat at the table, too, and when Gideon spotted the envelope there, his stomach started to riot.
What's going on?
He asked. Neither hide nor hair of Jonas or Spencer could be found, and Gideon sensed an intervention of sorts.
Nothing,
his dad said.
Sit down.
Gideon sat, looking from his father to his mother. He waited, his throat tightening with every second that passed.
First, we want to apologize for not having a conversation with you about the ranch.
Daddy started.
Dad,
Gideon said, frustration behind the single word.
It's fine. We don't need to keep going over this.
Gideon, his mother said, just listen. He nodded and looked down at the table. He really hadn't meant to make his father feel bad. At the same time, he should have had a conversation with all 3 of his sons about the ranch, Spencer included.
We know it's not the same,
Daddy said.
But we wanted to give you this, as you're now going off into the world on your own.
He pushed the envelope toward Gideon, who picked it up and opened it. Money sat inside. $100 bills. A lot of them. Surprise and horror struck him right behind his lungs.
I don't need this.
He set it down and slid it back to his dad.
I have a good job at IBM, Daddy. I'm doing great.
We want you to have it, Mama said, because we love you, and you're our son. She looked at him with such earnestness in her expression that he couldn't argue with her. If you don't need it now, save it. Then you'll have something to fall back on when times are lean." Gideon nodded as his father passed him the envelope again. "Things are serious with Penny, aren't they?" his mother asked. Gideon yanked his gaze back to hers.
"I suppose,"
he said. "I see how you are with her," Mama said. "I'd say they're serious, or about to be. Use that to buy her a nice ring." Heat filled Gideon's face.
"You don't think it's too fast?"
"Heaven only knows that," Mama said. "I met your father in the
grocery store,"
Gideon said with a smile.
"I've heard this story 1,000 times, Mama."
She smiled fondly at Daddy, and Gideon could see their love as plainly as the sun shone. He'd always felt it between them two, and he wondered if he looked at Penny like that. His chest warmed in the same way, and he suspected he was very, very close to being in love with her. It all felt crazy, but
"You were married in under 3 months,"
he said.
"Love at first sight." "Something like that,"
Daddy said gruffly as he got up from the table.
"It's late, and we're moving cattle tomorrow."
Gideon scrambled to his feet, the envelope clutched in his hands.
"Love you, Daddy. Love you too, son,"
he said as he hugged Gideon. His father didn't show emotion or get too physical, so the words and the embrace were real and important to Gideon. His mother repeated them, and they left him alone in the kitchen. He looked into the envelope again, thinking of the beautiful diamond the money could buy for Penny. A smile filled him from top to bottom, and he couldn't wait to see her tomorrow. Gideon pulled up to the egg warehouse the next morning, the white paper pastry bag his only passenger. Mac and Moose had somehow known he was going to see Penny, and they'd wanted to come. Maybe it was the way he'd talked about her nonstop that morning as he mowed the front lawn for her father. He didn't want to show up too early, but he didn't want to miss her either. It was just after 8 now, and Gideon's nerves pranced through his whole body. What if he was too early? Acting too eager? Just go, he told himself. Calling her every night was definitely eager, and he did that. He collected the pastry bag from the front seat and got out of his truck. The air was already hot, but it was quiet and peaceful here at the egg farm. Gideon liked this place. Penny was right. It did have a calm, relaxing feel to it. He walked over to the door and reached for the knob. He hoped she'd be surprised and that he could spend the day with her. By not telling her he was coming, she might have made other plans. Gideon stepped inside, noticing first that it wasn't any cooler in here than outside. The noise level went up because there were 2 huge fans blowing toward a long stainless steel table in the shape of an L. Penny stood in the nook of the L, right in front of a conveyor belt, lifting 3 eggs in each hand off the belt at a time. She was stunning, though her hair had wisps falling out of its ponytail, and she wore a T-shirt with the picture of a duck on it. His face burst into a smile as she looked over to the door, the light from outside probably catching her attention. She froze, her eyes wide. Gideon started laughing, and he suddenly couldn't get to her fast enough. "Hey, love," he said as he crossed the space between them. She dropped the eggs back onto the conveyor belt and hurried around the table to greet him. "Gideon!" She ran her hands up the side of his face, tipped up onto her toes, and kissed him. It was the best welcome Gideon had ever gotten. Chapter 10. "I can't believe it," Penny said again, looking up at him. "You're here." She kept moving her fingers up the back of his neck and into his hair, as if trying to convince herself that he was real.
"Surprise,"
he whispered, touching his lips to her jaw.
"I brought breakfast, too."
"Oh, now you're just showing off," Penny teased. She'd been in a terrible mood that morning because she didn't want to spend another weekend alone. She'd wanted to drive to Austin to see Gideon, and her father had said no. She wasn't all that experienced with driving, that was true. But Austin was only an hour away, and it seemed silly to pine for Gideon at home when she could see him in an hour. And now here he was.
"At least I thought I brought breakfast,"
he said, pulling away.
"I had a pastry bag in my hand, I swear."
He searched the floor, and sure enough, he stooped to pick it up. He grinned at her as he opened the bag.
Raspberry fritter for the pretty girl.
He handed it to her, and she almost burst into tears. He was so good, so kind, and thoughtful and amazing. She took the fritter and bit into it, the sweetness of the glaze combining with the tartness of the raspberry in the dough. Mmm. Her eyes rolled back in her head as he laughed.
Wow, I've missed you,
he said next, his hand brushing the side of her face as he tucked her hair behind her ear. He was tall, tough, and pure male, but his touch was gentle and soft. She looked at him, the need to kiss him again almost debilitating. She did just that, only pulling away when the speaker system from the back of the warehouse crackled. Darren's voice came through with,
"Pen, what's going on out there? We're backing up in here."
"Oh, my goodness," Penny said, her heartbeat jumping into the back of her throat. "The eggs." She handed the fritter back to Gideon and ran around the table to the conveyor belt. Luckily, she'd just laid out 3 of the 5 dozen crates, and she started picking up the eggs as quickly as she could.
"I can help,"
Gideon said, as he set the pastry bag on the corner of the table and rounded it to stand on the other side of the belt.
"Doesn't look too hard."
"Get it done then, cowboy," she said, her smile lifting her mouth in almost a clownish way. He was here. She couldn't believe he was here. The door behind her opened, and Darren said,
"We're backing up."
"I know," Penny said over her shoulder. "I'm getting caught up."
"What?"
Darren paused as he joined her at the belt. He reached for the eggs with one hand, and he only picked up one.
"Hello, Gideon. It's my fault,"
Gideon said. He at least picked up 2 eggs at a time, and he was using both hands.
"I distracted her for a minute." "I bet you did."
Penny elbowed her older brother in the ribs. "We're fine. Look, we're almost caught up already."
All right,
Darren said.
"I was just wondering. You don't normally fall behind."
"Didn't lose a single egg," Penny said as he started back toward the door. He left, and Penny looked at Gideon. He'd found his cowboy hat on the floor, too, and he'd repositioned it on his head. "Did you drive down this morning?"
"Last night,"
he said. "Last night?" Penny stared at him. "Gideon Walker, are you telling me that you called me from your parents' house last night?"
"Yes, ma'am."
He kept his head down, that brim a maddening barrier between the two of them. She huffed because she'd literally sat home alone last night. Her parents had gone to visit her aunt, and all 3 of her brothers had dates.
"I wanted it to be a surprise, sweetheart,"
he said. "I would have been just as surprised last night as I was this morning."
"Yeah, but then I wouldn't have gotten to see you in action."
He finally lifted his eyes to hers, and oh, he knew he was gorgeous and charming. The sparkle in his dark eyes said it all.
"I wanted to see the egg warehouse. You've never showed it to me."
"That's because it's not anything to be excited about," she said. "Though, did you see the big rigs when you pulled in? We just got them back from the detail shop, and they have tiger teeth on the front." She did like those, and the paint job brought her an unreasonable amount of joy.
"I didn't see them," he said. "I was a little nervous and pretty focused on just getting myself through the door."
"Why were you nervous?" He looked at her.
"Because you're you."
She smiled at him. "Is that a compliment, Mr. Walker?"
"Yes,"
he said, picking up another couple of eggs.
"I can't wait until you're in Austin. I can meet you at your apartment to unpack."
"That would be great," she said. "My dad is kind of pitching a fit about being gone, but he won't let me drive myself."
"I'll meet you, and he can go as soon as the last box is out of the truck."
Penny smiled and said, "I'm sure you'll learn some extra points for that." Gideon put his eggs in the crate, and Penny deftly stacked the 3 she'd laid out, one right on top of the other. She pushed the stack in line with the others, stretching way across the table to do it, and reached for 3 more crates.
"Do I need points?"
Gideon asked. Penny looked at him while she picked up the eggs. She'd been doing it so long she didn't even need to see them. I don't think so.
"I was hoping you and I—"
He cleared his throat.
"I'm not sure what your plans are for today, but I was thinking we could go to Jenner's."
A squeak came out of Penny's mouth. "Gideon?"
"It's not a proposal,"
he said quickly.
"but a man would like to know what his girlfriend likes in a diamond, so that if and when he's ready to make that step, he can get her a ring she'll like."
Penny stopped picking up eggs, but Gideon kept going. "Gideon," she said again. His chest rose and then fell, and then he looked at her.
"I'm about 5 minutes away from being in love with you,"
he said, just like that.
"Maybe you're not there yet. Maybe you won't get there. I'm not saying we're going to get married next week, or even engaged anytime soon. I'm just—"
He looked down again, working to get the eggs in the crate. Penny couldn't move, and she wasn't sure why. 5 minutes? He was only 5 minutes away from being in love with her?
"I just thought it would be fun,"
he said.
"If you don't want to go."
"I do," she said. He yanked his gaze to hers, and she realized what she'd said. She clapped one hand over her mouth and shook her head. I don't mean I do. I'd like to go to Jenner's with you."
"Okay, then."
"Okay." Penny managed to pick up an egg and put it in the tray. She felt like she'd never done it before, and her heart raced in circles in her chest. "What else were you thinking sounded like fun?"
"Lunch,"
he said.
"And then, well, I haven't thought much farther than the jewelry store and lunch."
"They're doing the hot air balloons at Stinger's ranch," she said. "Darren mentioned that he was going with his girlfriend."
"Sure,"
Gideon said.
"Whatever you want, Pen."
Penny felt like someone had stuck a light bulb inside her, and the glow of it was spreading through her whole body. Whatever she wanted. She wanted Gideon, she knew that. She wanted a family. She wanted to be a lawyer. Those 3 things still didn't line up in her mind, but she told herself what Gideon had just told her. It's not like you're going to get married next week, or even engaged. She had time to figure things out. Today, she just wanted to enjoy the time with her boyfriend. "Right here, Daddy," Penny said. "See where that blue car came out of?"
"I see it,"
her dad said, and he turned into the small parking lot. Her building was off the main road, behind a couple of other apartment buildings, and Penny liked that. It meant there wouldn't be a lot of traffic and no noise. Her dad backed into a parking space close to the steps, and the 2 of them got out of the truck. She glanced around for Gideon because he'd said he'd be there to help. She didn't see him, and she waited at the tailgate for her father to lower it. "I'm on the 3rd floor," she said.
"Of course you are,"
her dad grumbled as he picked up 2 boxes. Penny frowned, but she didn't say anything. Brandon had offered to bring her to Austin, but her father had insisted he do it. She'd helped every step of the way, and she'd had everything packed and ready. Yes, it was time out of his day, and Penny regretted that. But then he should have let Brandon bring her. She followed him up the 3 flights of stairs to the top floor of the apartment building and turned left. The front door was open, and it was clear some of her roommates had already moved in. Hannah poked her head out of the kitchen and said, "Penny!" Penny squealed and dropped her purse and backpack to hug Hannah. They laughed together, and suddenly it wasn't so bad that her dad was in a grumpy mood. "I left you tons of room for the sewing machine," Hannah said as she pulled away. "And I've got coffee on if you or your dad want some." Her dad had taken her boxes into her bedroom, and she glanced at him as he returned. "Hannah, my dad. Daddy, you remember Hannah, right? We roomed together last year."
"Yes, of course."
Penny almost rolled her eyes at the kindness in her father's tone. "She said she has coffee. You want some?"
"Not right now,"
he said, glancing at her.
"Let's just get unloaded."
With that, he left the apartment again, and Penny stooped to pick up her stuff. "Thanks, Hannah," she said, hurrying to put her purse and bag on her bed. 20 minutes later, and with Hannah's help, Penny had everything she needed on the third floor and not in the truck.
"All right, Sugar Bean,"
Daddy said, pulling Penny into a tight hug.
"You be safe and you be good. And you work hard."
"I will, Daddy," she said.
"I love you."
The words came out almost choked, and Penny realized then why he wanted to drive her. He loved her. He wanted to bring her to college, though it was very hard for him to do that. "Love you too, Daddy." He stepped back and nodded.
"Call your mother tonight, okay, baby?"
"I will," Penny said. He got behind the wheel of the truck and drove away, leaving Penny in the parking lot with 3 flights of stairs to climb, a sewing machine to set up, a bed to make, and boxes to unpack. She watched the truck until it turned and she couldn't see it anymore. Where in the world is Gideon? She wondered, because he was really late, and Gideon was hardly ever late. She didn't see him and she had work to do, so she climbed the steps and got to it. An hour later, someone knocked on the apartment door. The 3 girls who'd moved in already looked at one another. "That sounded kind of aggressive," Hannah said. She got up from the couch and peered through the slats in the blinds. "I can't see the front door from here. I don't know what I'm doing. I'll just get it," Penny said as she was the closest. She got up and ran her hands through her hair quickly, then stepped over to the door and opened it. Gideon stood there, his head down. He lifted his eyes to hers, and he wore remorse and regret there. "Gideon," she said, wishing her chest wasn't quite so tight.
"Hi, sweetheart."
"Oh, you don't get to sweetheart me," she said. "You didn't show up to help, and you said you would." She gestured for him to come in. "My roommates were just taking bets on if you were real or not." Gideon took off his cowboy hat as he stepped into the apartment. "Here he is, girls," Penny said. "My boyfriend, Gideon Walker." She indicated the 2 other women standing in the living room. "Hannah's my roommate. Giselle lives across the hall from us. Our other roommate isn't here yet."
"Hello, ladies,"
Gideon said, worrying the brim of his cowboy hat. He turned to Penny and didn't bother keeping his voice down when he said,
"I had to go into work. I'm so sorry. I wanted to be here, but I had no way to call. I even called your mother, but she didn't have this number."
"You had to work on a Saturday?"
"We're really on to something right now,"
he said.
"Justin called me about 10 minutes before I would have left to come help. I swear. I'm sorry, Pen."
"How sorry?" Hannah asked, inserting herself into the conversation. Gideon looked at her, clear confusion in his expression. Penny understood where this was going, though. "Yeah," she said, joining Hannah. The 2 of them folded their arms simultaneously. "How sorry? Like, sorry enough to go get donuts from the Flying Pig?" She looked at Hannah, and so much was communicated between them. "That would mean he's pretty sorry. I might just have to forgive him if he brought back the maple porker." "Oh, no," Hannah said, with plenty of mock disgust in her voice. "If he wants to be forgiven, he's going to need to bring back the Elvis Presley." They looked at Gideon, and Penny couldn't help the wide smile as it spread across her face. He simply stared at her, as if she'd hit him upside the head with a 2x4.
"The Flying Pig?"
he asked. "It's a donut truck," Penny said. "My favorite. And it's my first day in town, and my boyfriend was super late, and I'm starving because he said he'd bring breakfast, and look, no breakfast." Gideon's smile took longer to appear.
"The Flying Pig. Maple porker. Elvis Presley."
He turned to Giselle.
"What do I need to do to earn your forgiveness?"
Giselle, who Penny didn't know hardly at all, looked from him to Penny and back. "Do you have a brother?" Penny burst out laughing, and she linked her arm through Gideon's. "Come on, cowboy," she said. "I'll go with you to get the donuts." Chapter 11. Gideon swiped the stack of folders from his desk without breaking his stride. He was late leaving for class. He'd been late to his meeting this morning, too, because his brainstorming session with Justin had gone over. Gideon hated being late, but he felt like he'd been running behind for a week now. School had started, and while Justin had originally given him permission to leave at 2 p.m. on Tuesdays and Thursdays, he was 2 days in and it wasn't going well. He had homework already, and he'd stayed late at work on Monday and Wednesday to keep caught up with his responsibilities. He barely had time to eat, shower, and sleep, and he hadn't seen Penny in days. He'd called her a couple of times, but that had really been to reschedule their date. A frown pulled through him and across his face, because he had a feeling he'd have to cancel tomorrow, too. It was always busy at the beginning of a new semester, Gideon knew. Things would settle down once he figured out how to balance everything. He loved his job at IBM, and he was learning so much there. His classes focused on patent law, technology advancements, and business administration systems. Gideon felt like he needed the classes, but his on-site experience was valuable too. He and Justin were still in negotiations with Intel, but they hadn't slammed the door in their faces. Meanwhile, the higher-ups at IBM had given the development department the charge to figure out the microprocessing chip. As if it were that easy. Gideon hurried to his truck, and he may have driven a bit over the speed limit to get to campus. He slipped in the back of the classroom and glanced around for a place to sit. Thankfully, this was the second day of class, and humans were creatures of habit. They stuck to where they'd sat on the first day, and Gideon managed to go down a couple of rows and step over one person to get to a seat. He took a notebook out of his backpack and tried to clue in to what the professor was saying. His mind drifted because he was tired, and he had a ton of other things to do. Frustration built in him over the next few hours because he felt like he was wasting his time. By the time he got home, pure exhaustion pulled through him. He managed to make scrambled eggs and toast, and he ate at the small table in the kitchen with his folders in front of him. The next thing he knew, the telephone woke him. Its shrill ring startled him, and he sat up straight, his heart pounding. The room had gotten darker, but it wasn't all the way dark yet. He jumped to his feet as his full awareness came back, and he quickly crossed the kitchen to the phone. "Hello?"
Gideon?
Penny said. A smile touched his lips.
"Hey, sweetheart."
You forgot, didn't you?
Gideon's synapses started firing because the disappointment in her voice, combined with her words, had surprised him.
"I suppose I did."
Because he still couldn't remember what he'd forgotten.
It's okay, she said. Hannah can borrow her boyfriend's car. We can use that to go grocery shopping.
"Oh, the grocery shopping,"
he said, foolishness moving through him.
"I'm sorry, I can come right now."
It's okay,
Penny said, but Gideon had the feeling it wasn't.
"I'll leave right now," he said. "I'll be there in 10 minutes.
Penny didn't protest again, but she did sigh. Gideon reached for his keys because he wanted to see Penny.
10 minutes,
he said again, and he hung up and headed out. He'd gotten a little nap at the table, and by the time he got to Penny's apartment, he was wide awake. She waited on the bottom step of the staircase that led up to her apartment. Gideon put the truck in park, left it running, and got out. Penny stood, and she was the best thing he'd seen in days.
"I'm so sorry."
He took her into his arms, and he was glad she let him. The storm she wore on her face hadn't been hard to see.
"I'm just busy right now,"
he said, his mouth at her ear.
"I'll get a schedule worked out, I swear."
It's fine, she said. Hannah had already called her boyfriend, so it's just me.
She stepped back and straightened her blouse. She wore a pink, purple, and red-striped shirt with a dark brown pair of corduroy pants, and Gideon wondered if she'd made them. She made a lot of her clothes, and they fit like a glove. He reached for her hand.
"I'm sorry,"
he said again. A smile finally appeared on her face, and he felt like she'd started to forgive him. "How's class?" she asked.
Long,"
Gideon said.
"I think I'm going to need to drop one of them."
Which one?
"Patent law,"
he said.
"There's no way I can keep up with the homework and keep my job. And Penny."
He glanced at her, and she nodded. If you think you should.
I should,
he said.
I'll call them tomorrow.
He opened the passenger door for her, and Penny paused instead of getting in. I miss you, Gideon. She stretched up and kissed him, and Gideon knew he couldn't neglect her or he'd lose her. He couldn't forget the things he said he'd do for her, and as he kissed her, he vowed to do better. After she pulled away, he said,
I'll do better, okay?
The beginning of the semester is busy, she said. She climbed into the truck, and Gideon went around to the driver's side.
How have your classes been?
He asked, glancing at her.
Good? Hard?
2 of them won't be too bad, she said. It's advanced chemistry that's going to take most of my time. She looked out her window, and she was simply beautiful to him. She'd braided her auburn hair that day, and he liked the way she sat with her purse in her lap. He enjoyed walking around the grocery store with her. Such a simple thing, but so much fun. She opened up more once there, and by the time he dropped her off, things between them were back to normal. Gideon made it home, a sigh coming out of his mouth as he got out of the truck and went inside.
It's just the beginning of the semester,
he told himself as he left the folders on the table and went down the hall to his bedroom. He brushed his teeth and changed into his pajamas and dropped to his knees.
Lord,
he said,
I know I need to do better. I just don't know how.
He fell silent because that was the gist of everything streaming through him. Maybe he just didn't have enough time to do everything. He wanted the job at IBM for sure. He needed a way to make money. He wanted Penny, too, and a man needed to be able to support his wife and family. As he got in bed, he looked up at the ceiling.
Maybe I should drop the classes.
If he wanted to keep Penny and keep his job, he probably should. He'd sleep on it, and then he'd decide when he wasn't so tired and so overwhelmed and fresh off a failure with his girlfriend. Chapter 12. Penny looked up as the bus started to slow again. She still had 4 stops to go, and she could probably get through this next section in her chemistry book. She had a test coming up, and she wanted to score the highest. The professor put up a list of the scores, with numbers as the identifier for each person. On the last test, she'd been second. The competitive spirit inside her wanted that top spot, especially since the person who'd been at the top had bragged about it to everyone on campus. Okay, that was an exaggeration, but everyone in the class knew Trevor Siemens had scored the highest. He'd made sure of that. He'd also made sure that Penny knew he was smarter than her. He sneered at her in the lab, and he scowled when she answered questions correctly. She was fine with how he treated her. She was fine studying on her own, though she'd heard several others making groups and talking about sharing notes. They hadn't invited her because the class was 95% men, and they didn't know what to do with Penny. She looked up again, her eyes moving to the man standing at the back of the bus. He looked away, but Penny knew he'd been watching her. She went back to her book, but now she could feel his eyes. She hadn't seen him before, but he did seem familiar. If he went to UT Austin and rode this bus, she might have seen him before. She gave up on the chemistry and stuck her book back in her pack. She stood up once her stop was next, and she stepped right past the man as she got off the bus. He got off right after her. Penny's heartbeat accelerated, but she forced herself to walk at a normal speed and not look over her shoulder. Maybe this was his stop, too. The others who'd gotten off dispersed, and Penny started down the street toward the white apartment buildings a couple of blocks down. She could hear footsteps behind her, but she refused to turn and look. Gideon had promised to pick her up right after school today, because she'd told him she'd make dinner for them tonight. He was going to show her where he lived, and she was excited to spend the evening with him. They hadn't seen each other much over the past month, but Penny had barely settled into her own schedule, and she couldn't imagine working as much as Gideon did and going to school. Gideon had dropped the patent law class, and he'd seemed to be able to manage his responsibilities better, but she missed him immensely. She'd thought things would be different once they were living in the same place, but she'd forgotten how busy college was. She paused at the corner to wait for the light to change. The man who'd been watching her stepped up beside her. Their eyes met, and Penny's natural reaction was to smile. So she did. He returned it, and Penny supposed he was good-looking. He had dark brown hair and dark brown eyes, and a much darker complexion than she did. He wasn't as tall as Gideon, and he didn't have a cowboy hat, so that was definitely a strike against him. Not that Penny was looking for another boyfriend. In fact, nothing about this man called to her the way everything about Gideon did.
"Hey,"
he said. "Hi." Penny tightened the straps on her backpack and faced forward. She didn't want to encourage him, and she had a feeling she was going to have to reject him. When the light turned green, they stepped off the curb together, and he said,
"I'm Simon."
"Penny," she said, trying to keep her voice crisp.
"I was wondering if you ride that bus every night,"
he said. "Yes," she said. "I live one street over." In fact, she could cross the street now and cut through a couple of parking lots to get to her building. Maybe she should. Then she could spare Simon's feelings and avoid an awkward situation.
"I'm in Cambridge Court,"
he said. "Oh, I'm just across the street from that," she said. "King Henry Court."
"Right. I think I've seen you before."
Simon smiled at her, and he wasn't nervous. They walked to the next corner and turned to go across the street. Her building was on this side and his on the other, and as Penny approached, she had a feeling Simon was going to ask her out.
"I was wondering if you'd want to get together,"
he said.
"For dinner or something."
He paused next to the sidewalk that led to his building. Penny took a couple more steps and turned back to him. "I can't, Simon. I'm sorry."
"Okay,"
he said.
"Boyfriend?"
"Yes," she said. "How did you know?" Simon nodded past her, and Penny turned to find Gideon walking down the sidewalk toward them. Her whole soul lit up, and she knew the difference between Simon and Gideon instantly.
"Hey, sweetheart,"
he said, his voice far too loud. He put his arm around her, and Penny gaped at him. She'd never seen jealousy on him, and he wore it, obviously. "This is Simon," Penny said. "Simon, this is Gideon."
"Nice to meet you,"
Gideon said, his smile plastic as he reached to shake Simon's hand.
"You too,"
Simon said.
"I was just going to ask Penny if she wanted to get together to study with me."
Penny whipped her attention back to him. His smile was much more relaxed.
"I saw you with that chemistry book. I'm in that class with Monroe, and I'm pretty sure I'm going to fail."
"You want to study with me?" Penny asked, her hopes shooting higher than she'd thought they would. No one ever wanted to study with her. No men, at least.
"I have a feeling you know what you're doing,"
he said.
"So yes, definitely."
Penny looked at Gideon, her eyes wide. His smile relaxed, and he nodded at Simon.
"You should, Pen. You've always wanted a study group."
"Yes," Penny said, the strangest urge to hug Simon coming over her. "Let's get together to study."
"Great,"
Simon said, shrugging off his backpack.
"If this next exam is as tough as Monroe says it's going to be, I'm going to need all the help I need."
He dug in his bag.
"Let me find a pen to get your number."
He did, and he scratched his out and ripped the sheet off to give it to her.
"And yours?"
She gave it to him, and he nodded.
"I'll call you later to set something up, or maybe I'll see you on the bus again."
"Okay," Penny said. "I'll be home later tonight." Giddiness filled her as Simon walked away. She turned to Gideon and squealed as she jumped into his arms. He laughed with her, and once they started toward her building, she exhaled. "A real study group, Gideon."
"That's great, Pen,"
he said, but the words sounded a little false. Penny looked at him and squeezed his hand. "You're not jealous, are you?"
"That's 100% yes,"
he said. Penny laughed, because it was a laughable idea. He really had no idea how he affected her, or how amazing he was. "You don't need to be," she said.
"No?"
"Absolutely not," she said, wondering how bold to be. She'd always said what she'd thought and felt with Gideon, and she saw no need to change now. "I felt nothing when I looked at him. Then I turned around and saw you, and wow." They reached his truck and he took her backpack from her to lift it over the tailgate. He faced her.
Wow?
Wow, she repeated. You're... She didn't know how to tell him what she felt when she looked at him. They'd been dating for over 2 months now, which Penny knew wasn't a terribly long time, but she'd never once been bored with Gideon. He always had a fascinating story to tell about IBM, and he asked her about her life, her classes, her worries, her dreams. He seemed genuinely interested in her, and he supported everything she wanted to do in her life. Gideon simply waited for her to tell him what he was, and Penny couldn't find the words. She stepped back into his arms and wrapped her hands around the back of his neck. His hands on her waist were warm, and they fit perfectly. She closed her eyes and enjoyed the moment as he leaned his forehead against hers. "You're amazing," she whispered, feeling like they were the only 2 people on the planet in that moment. "When I see you, instant joy fills me. My stomach swoops, and I can't wait for you to kiss me. I want to be with you every day, and I want to spend all my free time with you." There, that summed it up really well, in her opinion.
Wow,
Gideon whispered.
that is something, I guess.
Penny opened her eyes and pulled away enough to see his face. "And? What happens when you see me?" Gideon searched her face, his expression full of seriousness. She saw a burning fire of desire, too, and she felt it moving through her as well.
"When I see you, all I can think about is making you my wife,"
he said. Surprise shot through Penny and her eyebrows lifted. She didn't know what to say, though they'd already looked at rings in Sweet Creek. He'd just never said anything about marriage again.
"I want to be yours,"
he said.
"and I want you to be mine, and I want everyone, including guys like Simon, to know you're taken."
He ducked his head.
"Sorry about the jealousy. I guess it just reared up, and I saw you walking with him, and I got out to come meet you."
"It's fine," she said. "Are we really talking about getting married?"
"It's been on my mind," Gideon said. "I know it's fast, and I don't mind going slow. Maybe next summer or something."
"Hey, you 2," Hannah said, and Penny stepped out of Gideon's arms, though she hadn't kissed him yet, and she really wanted to.
"Hey, Hannah,"
Gideon said, walking toward Penny's door.
"How's school?"
"Busy," Hannah said. "I'm working tonight, Pen. I'll come in quietly." "Okay," Penny said. "I'm making dinner at Gideon's, but I should be home before you." "Have fun," she said, and she got in Rob's car as he pulled up.
"Should we go?"
Gideon asked, and Penny nodded as she slipped past him. The drive to his place only took 10 minutes, and he pulled up to the cutest little white house Penny had ever seen. "Wow, Gideon," she said. "This is so much better than an apartment."
"It is," he agreed. "I did the roommate thing for a while, and this is better."
They got out, and Penny looked at the emerald green lawn. "Do you do the yard work?"
"Yes,"
he said.
"They give me a reduced rent if I do."
He looked right down the street.
"I help a lady down the road a bit, too. She's single with a couple of little kids. I need to get down there and see how she's doing."
Penny's heart warmed at his kindness and care of others, and just when she didn't think she could find him more attractive, it turned out she could.
"I got everything you said you needed,"
he said, leading her into the house.
"Kitchen here. That table is as close to a dining room as you'll get."
He went through a doorway, and she took a moment to take in the kitchen. A long counter took up the back of the house, and it had everything in that one strip. Fridge in the corner, coffee maker on the counter next to that, stove, more counter space, sink, more counter space. She followed him into the living room, which held 2 couches and a big boxy television.
"I spread out a little,"
he said, gathering up papers and stuffing them into folders.
"The table isn't big enough."
"You don't have to clean up," she said. "We can stay in the kitchen." He stopped and looked at her, a hint of his nerves there.
2 bedrooms off the kitchen,"
he said.
I use one for an office, but the chair in there isn't very comfortable."
Penny smiled at him and asked, "Would you go get my backpack? I forgot it and I need to study while the casserole bakes."
"Sure thing, sweetheart."
He left through the front door to do that, and Penny got to work on the chicken and wild rice bake she'd promised him. They chatted in the kitchen, and he told her about a man at work named Marcus who'd gone on his first date with a woman that had been a complete disaster. Penny laughed harder than she ever had, and she curled into Gideon's side as they sat on the couch together, both of them studying something important to them. For her, it was chemistry, and the time with Gideon was the epitome of what she wanted in her life. His phone rang, and he eased away from her to go answer it. She could hear his voice from the kitchen, but she focused on the complicated processes in her book. A minute later, he entered the living room again, the jangle of his keys alerting her to the fact that something was about to happen.
"I have to run into work for a minute,"
he said. "You do?"
"I left something there that I need for Justin," he said. "I'm just driving there and back. I'll be gone maybe 40 minutes.
He stepped closer and swept a kiss along her hairline.
"I'm sorry. The food still has 25 minutes in the oven. You'll barely know I've been gone."
"Okay," she said, and he left. Penny sat in his quiet house, wondering why she'd said it was okay for him to go. She didn't want him to go. She wanted to sit beside him and be with him. She sighed as she went back to her studying. She took the food out of the oven when the timer went off. She poured herself a glass of the sweet tea he had in his fridge and went back to studying. She completed her mathematics homework and finished her tea, and Gideon still hadn't returned. Dinner grew cold, and Penny's patience ran out. She reheated the oven and stuck the food back in. When he'd been gone for twice as long as he'd said he would be, she packed up her books and served herself a plate of chicken and wild rice, and she ate alone. She stood at his sink washing her plate when he finally walked in.
"Sorry,"
he said, but Penny only glared at him. She left the plate in the sink and bent to get her backpack. "I'm ready to go," she said.
"Go? We haven't eaten."
"I did," she said. "You do realize how long you've been gone, right?" Gideon sighed and ran his hand down his face.
"Justin was in the office, and I couldn't leave."
"Yes, you can," Penny said. "You say, 'Hey, sorry, but my girlfriend took time out of her busy schedule to make dinner for me and I can't stay.' Then you walk out."
"It's not that simple, Pen,"
he said, stepping around her and picking up the second plate she'd gotten out of the cupboard. He put a piece of chicken on it and plenty of wild rice. She blinked, and her whole future flashed before her eyes. "Will you always pick work over me?" she asked. She should at least know with perfect clarity what she was getting into.
"Of course not,"
he said. "What if Justin calls when we're about to sit down to dinner, or when it's time to bathe our son, or when we're leaving to visit our parents, or—"
"Okay,"
Gideon said, throwing her a dark look.
"I get it."
"You can't just run off whenever he calls."
"He's my boss,"
Gideon said.
"and I love this job and I'm learning so much."
Penny nodded because she knew all of that. Gideon had said it all before. "You have to have a line you won't cross."
"I have to keep my job, too,"
he said.
"Who do you think is going to pay for the house we live in? Or the water bill to bathe that son?"
He cocked his eyebrows at her. "Your family should come first." He took his plate to the table and sighed as he sat down.
"I don't want to fight about this,"
he said.
"I'm trying, Penny. I have to have a job. You want as many children as the good Lord will give you. They're not free."
"I know that," she said quietly.
"Do you?"
he asked, looking over his shoulder to where she stood. His glare punched her in the chest.
"You can give up being a lawyer to be a mother, if that's what you want to do. I can't just leave my career on the line because then we'll end up living with my parents. Or yours."
He turned around again, and all of Penny's nerves vibrated. A full minute passed, and Penny didn't know what to say or do. He was right, but she was too. She didn't want him to run off every night just because someone called. She wanted to be more important than some things.
"Please come sit with me,"
he said quietly. He looked at her.
"Please?"
Penny crossed the kitchen on wooden legs and sat down at the only other chair at the table. He kept his head down as he ate, and the tension between them felt like it might snap her bones clean in half.
I'm sorry,
he finally said.
Maybe I do need to draw a line somewhere, but Pen, I don't know where to do that.
I understand, she said. Gideon looked at her, and everything hard on his face softened.
I can't stand you being mad at me,
he whispered, reaching out to cup her face.
But I don't know how to stop disappointing you.
You don't disappoint me, she said, feeling ridiculous for demanding he put her and their fictitious children above everything else.
Yes, I do,
he said.
I want to do something with my life, Pen. I want to invent something. I want to be right on the cutting edge of technology. I'm sure there's a line, but I fear if I draw it now, I'll miss out on something I really want to do.
She nodded, her boldness and bravery suddenly on vacation. So she didn't say what was circling through her mind. If he didn't draw the line now, maybe he would miss out on something he really wanted. Her, and the possibility of a life with her and those children the good Lord would give them. Chapter 13. Gideon pushed the lawnmower back and forth, getting the grass cut at his place, hopefully for the last time for a while. Autumn had finally arrived in Austin, and the grass wasn't nearly as vibrant as it had been when he'd moved in. When he finished at his place, he walked the mower down the road to Savannah's, where he found her 2 little boys playing happily on the front driveway. He waved to them, a smile etched on his face, and got to work getting her lawn cleaned up, too. She came out onto the front porch as he finished up and said, "Thank you, Gideon."
"Sure thing," he called to her. "Everything else okay? Need anything?"
"We're okay," she said with a smile. "Thanks, though." He waved and went home to shower. It was the weekend, and he determined he would not work a minute of it. He'd drawn the line. He had no idea what he'd do if Justin called, or if Gideon suddenly remembered he needed to have a brief ready for a meeting on Monday morning. A couple of weeks had passed since the awkward and tense night with Penny, where she'd made the most delicious dinner he'd eaten since moving to Austin. He could make a few things, but he didn't want to spend time in the kitchen, so his breakfasts consisted of coffee and toast, and his dinners were something he could whip up in minutes: pancakes, eggs, sandwiches. He put in a load of laundry and made a grocery list. He showered and switched his clothes to the dryer. He went and got his groceries, and right when he'd said he'd bring lunch to Penny and Simon, he pulled into her parking lot and reached for the paper bags of hamburgers and fries he'd bought. Gideon liked Simon well enough, but he didn't believe for a single second that the man really only wanted to be Penny's study buddy. Gideon had tried that tactic to spend time with a woman he liked too, and he'd seen the way Simon looked at Penny, even if she didn't. Their test was on Monday, and Gideon actually hoped the study group would break up after that.
"Hey,"
he said when he found them sitting at the single table behind her building. At least she was smart enough not to invite him into her apartment. They studied on campus, or at this table, and Gideon took a moment to kiss her hello. They hadn't spoken of marriage again, nor had Gideon promised something he couldn't deliver. He'd stopped asking her out for weeknights, as he usually spent those doing homework or at the office, and he really couldn't stomach the thought of disappointing Penny. They'd spoken on the phone several times, and he'd seen her last weekend, too.
"Thanks for the food,"
Simon said, and Gideon just smiled at him. They ate while Penny quizzed Simon with the note cards they'd made. When he started doing the same for her, Gideon pulled out his own homework and finished it. He hated sitting around doing nothing, and his first thought was to go into the office and read the development report from that week.
No,
he told himself. He wasn't working this weekend. He couldn't turn off his brain, though, and he really did hate sitting around.
"How much longer are you guys going to be?"
he asked. Penny looked at him with surprise in her eyes. "The test is on Monday?"
"So, a while,"
he said.
"If so, I'll catch up with you tonight, okay?"
He stood from the picnic table and bent down to kiss her. She was definitely distracted, and as he walked away, annoyance burned through him.
"So it's okay for her to focus on what's important to her, at my expense, but I can't do the same."
He shook his head as he got behind the wheel of his truck, and then he set himself on the highway and just drove. By the time his irritation and frustration had ebbed, he was only 15 minutes away from the ranch, and he figured he might as well visit his parents for a few minutes. He pulled off the highway and went past the Walker family gate. Under the shade of the trees, he parked the truck and peered at the house. No one came out to greet him, but that wasn't that surprising. They were probably all working, even his mother. A dog barked, and then Moose jumped up and put his front paws on Gideon's window. He laughed as he opened the door, and Moose fell back.
"Hey, buddy."
Moose barked a few more times as Gideon rubbed him down.
"Oh, you're dirty,"
Gideon said as he chuckled. He dusted his hands off and looked around for Mac. The other dog came running around the corner of the house, and Gideon laughed as he nearly fell on his face in his exuberance. The barking dogs had alerted his mother to someone at the farmhouse, and she'd come out onto the porch. "Gideon, baby," she said in her thick accent. "What are you doing here?"
"Just came to visit,"
he said.
"What are y'all up to around here?"
"I'm making applesauce today,"
she said. In that moment, Gideon smelled the cinnamon floating on the air. He wondered how he'd missed it before.
"I can help you peel,"
he said. His mother laughed.
"Oh, you must be bored."
Gideon didn't confirm it or deny it, but he climbed the steps and took his mother into a hug. He loved the fierceness with which his mother hugged him, and he held her for an extra few seconds. "What's wrong, baby?" she asked as she drew back.
"Nothing,"
Gideon said, his smile trembling a little. "How's work?"
"Good."
"Your classes?"
"Fine."
"Gideon," she said, "I get more than one-word answers." She turned to go into the house, and he followed her. She gave him a break as she walked into the kitchen, which looked like a bomb filled with apples and jars had gone off. She checked a timer and turned back to him. "This will go off in 6 minutes. I get to listen to you talk for that time. Then you can be done."
"I've got nothing to say, Mama,"
he said, sitting down at the table.
"How's Penny?"
Gideon sighed and reached up to take his cowboy hat off.
"Ah, there it is,"
Mama said.
"Get talking, Gideon, or I'll turn this timer up."
She wouldn't, and he knew it, because she was using that to time the jars in the pressure cooker right now.
"We're serious,"
Gideon said.
"I'm fairly sure I'm in love with her. I want to be with her. I want to build a family together. But I also want this career at IBM, or somewhere. Doesn't have to be IBM, but I'm learning a lot there. The possibilities are honestly endless, Mama, and I want to be in on all of them."
"I know you do, son."
"Penny wants me to pick her first,"
he said.
"I want that too, but don't I have to make a living? I don't know how to balance those. How did you and Daddy do it?"
Mama reached over and covered Gideon's hands with hers.
"It takes work, and forgiveness, and a lot of discussion. If you and Penny are serious about your relationship, you'll make time for each other. If she's serious about supporting you and you're serious about supporting her, you'll figure out what that looks like for both of yous and what you can sacrifice and what you can't."
Gideon nodded, remaining quiet. His worries didn't ease much, though he had seen his mother and father work through things together. The real issue was Penny. He needed to know what she was willing to put up with and what she wasn't. In the conversations they'd already had, it sounded like she wasn't willing to have him work past 5 p.m. or ever take phone calls at home. To him, that was unreasonable, especially for his line of work.
"A conversation,"
he said.
"I can do that."
He didn't really want to, but Gideon had endured hard conversations in the past, most recently with his father and Jonas about the ranch. He could talk to Penny, too.
"Thanks, Mama."
He stood up, thinking he'd just head back to Austin now. Penny would finish up her studying, and perhaps Gideon could call her and ask her to dinner. At the same time, he thought maybe he'd just head back to his little house, do some cleaning, and go look at dogs at the animal shelter. He knew he couldn't get a pet right now, but he could look.
"You're leaving?" Mama asked. "Don't go. I can put on a fresh pot of coffee and whip up a pot of macaroni."
His mother's solution to most problems was macaroni and cheese. Gideon had never minded before, because his mama's cooking did soothe the soul. Her recipe had been handed down for generations, and Gideon loved the heritage of his ancestors.
"I can't stay long, Mama,"
he said.
"I have to get back by 5.
She glanced at the clock. "That's 2 hours, son." She stood up. "I'll get the water boiling." Chapter 14. Penny pushed her notes across the table to Simon, ignoring the laughter coming from a group of students at the table behind them. "It's the electron isotopes Dr. Monroe was talking about in the last class." Simon looked at the notebook, a blank expression on his face.
"I was here for that, but my notes don't look like that at all."
He sighed and put his head down.
"I'm never going to get this."
"Sure you will," Penny said encouragingly. "You passed the last test."
"Barely,"
he said.
"I wasn't anywhere near the top. That one person got 99%.
He sounded miserable, and Penny buried her nose in the book. She was that one person who'd scored the highest on their last test. She hadn't told anyone in the class, and when she'd seen her number at the top, above Trevor's, she'd known no such joy. She'd only told Gideon, and he'd laughed with her, spun her around, and kissed her after he'd told her how amazing she was. He'd been mostly on time in the past couple of weeks, and they had plans for Halloween night. Both of them would take the whole night off, her from studying and him from his homework and work, and attend a costume party together. Gideon didn't want to go at all. He'd rather stay home in his cowboy hat and hand out candy to the little children that came by his house. Penny had talked him into the campus-wide event, and she'd been praying it would be a success for the past week.
"Here comes trouble,"
Simon said under his breath, and Penny looked up. Simon kept his attention on her notebook, and she glanced to her right. Trevor and his posse were only steps away.
"What do we have here?"
the man sneered. Penny's defenses flew into place. She wanted to snap her notebook closed so he couldn't see anything he might have missed in class. "We're studying," Penny said, her voice hard. Trevor grinned at the 3 other men with him.
"The 2 losers of the class,"
he said.
"It's cute how you think if you study, you'll actually pass."
"I did pass," Simon said. Trevor put both hands on their table and leaned into them.
"Probably at the very bottom of the cut."
"It doesn't matter," Penny said, her protective streak rising up as she stood. "He passed. It doesn't matter where." There'd been at least 6 scores lower than Simon's.
"Yeah? And where did you end up?"
Trevor asked, his gaze sliding down Penny's torso. She wanted to deck him right in the mouth. "None of your business." She didn't dare look back at her book, though. Trevor and his friends laughed, which only spurred Penny's anger. She coached herself not to respond. They didn't get to know her score. That was the point of using the student numbers, though a lot of people in the class simply told one another. "Do you want to study with us?" Penny asked. "Maybe then you'll pass the next test, too." Trevor's laugh turned cruel, and Penny braced herself for an insult.
"Please. I don't need you to help me pass."
He knocked on the table.
"I'll let you get back to it. I'm going to be applying to law school in the spring, too, and you'll be up against me." "I think Penny can handle you,"
another man said, and Penny's heart raced. Gideon stood behind the other group, a couple of brown bags in his hand. He looked past Trevor to Penny, a smile coming over his face.
"Hey, love."
She smiled back at him because he was there, on time, with lunch, and defensive of her. He stepped past Trevor while he and the others stared, and leaned down to kiss Penny. Before he did, he whispered,
"Please let me tell them."
"No," she said, touching her lips to his real quick. "Thanks for bringing lunch." She took the bags and passed one to Simon.
"Thanks, Gideon,"
he said.
"Oh, the organic unit,"
Gideon said, his voice much too casual to actually be casual.
"I didn't do well on this at all." Your girlfriend won't either, Trevor said. It's really cute how she thinks she can be a lawyer.
Penny felt the indignation flow from Gideon. He took a step toward Trevor, who actually fell back.
Here we go,
Simon said, and he looked absolutely gleeful.
She can be a lawyer,
Gideon said.
Why wouldn't she be able to? How many female lawyers do you know?
Trevor challenged.
How is that relevant at all?
Gideon asked.
If she has the grade, she can apply and get in. She'll be 10 times the lawyer you'll be.
He looked down to Trevor's feet and back. Gideon, let it go, Penny said, though she fell a little more in love with him for what he'd said. He'd never made her feel like her dreams and ambitions were limited by her gender. He'd never made her feel like she wasn't smart enough to do whatsoever she wanted to do. Gideon turned around.
I'm going to tell him.
Penny drew in a breath and gestured for him to get on with it then.
She scored the 99 on the last test,
Gideon said after zeroing in on Trevor and his group again.
I think you were, 88? 4th in the class this time, I believe.
He moved to Penny's side, their eyes meeting for the briefest moment. He put his arm around her and they faced Trevor together.
You got the 99?
Simon asked, his voice incredulous.
Yes, Penny said.
No way,
Trevor said, his normal bluster completely gone.
74202,
Penny said.
That's me.
She looked up at Gideon, who was smiling at Trevor as if to say, so there.
Come on, baby,
she said to Gideon.
Let's eat, and then you better get back to work.
Sure thing, sugar.
He laid the accent on extra thick, and Penny didn't mind a bit.
I got those sweet potato fries you like so much. The maple glaze is for you, Simon. Thanks, Gideon,
Simon said. He fixed his gaze on Penny.
How in the world did you get 99?
She just smiled at him and said, Let's go over the respiration process again. I'm not so sure on that part.
Gideon took out her chicken salad and a bag of sweet potato fries, while Trevor and his friends grumbled and walked away. She sat back down, Gideon at her side, and she glanced at him as she put her hand on his leg under the table. He met her eyes, and so much was said between them in that moment that Penny couldn't wait to be alone with him, so she could kiss him with all the feelings currently running through her body.
Respiration, I get,
Simon said, focusing on her notebook.
It's this reverse osmo something or other I don't understand.
A few days later, Penny swiped on the last of her makeup and shimmied into the flapper dress she'd been working on for 2 weeks. The silver fabric hugged her minimal curves and fell to the floor in long sheets that made her feel like one of the rich and famous from the 1920s. She pinned feathers in her hair and stood in front of the full-length mirror in her bedroom to examine her costume. Her mother would most definitely not approve of the thin straps that went over her shoulders, leaving everything else bare. Penny loved the dress, though, and she didn't have to check anything off with her mother. She'd be 20 years old in a couple of months, and if she wanted to wear a spaghetti-strap dress, she could. She went out into the living room of the apartment and found Hannah and Rob there, sitting close together on the couch, talking. They held hands, and Penny thought they were super cute together.
Well,
she asked, turning around like a runway model.
What do you think?
Hannah squealed and jumped up. I think you look amazing, Pen, she said. I should have had you sew me a dress. She hugged Penny, who giggled with her best friend.
You're not even dressing up,
Penny said, stepping back and adjusting the feathers that had come loose.
We're going to this church thing,
Hannah said, and she sounded less than enthused about it.
We're running the fish pond.
Oh, for your dad? Penny asked, looking to Rob. His father ran a congregation in Austin, and Hannah went there for church every week. Penny had been attending with Gideon, and she liked his pastor well enough to keep going. Plus, she liked sitting next to the tall, strong cowboy who held her hand through the sermon. Last week, he'd leaned toward her and asked her to come to his house for lunch afterward. He'd put a chicken in the slow cooker, and he'd even managed to peel potatoes and fry them to go with the protein. Penny had been impressed, though she knew Gideon could feed himself. He could go grocery shopping and pay his bills and manage his time, too. He didn't need her to be his mother, and honestly, that was one of the most refreshing things about him.
"Yeah,"
Rob said with a sigh as he got up.
"we should go too, Hannah, so we're not late."
"Have fun," Penny said, though Hannah rolled her eyes when Rob turned his back. She smothered the giggle while they left, and then she filled a glass with water and drank, hoping Gideon would show up soon. He was already late, but Penny had started expecting him to be 5 to 10 minutes late all the time. When 15 minutes came, Penny stepped outside. It had cooled considerably in Austin this past week, and she shivered against the night air. It was dark already, and she couldn't help looking toward campus, thinking of the fun they were missing. She sat on the bottom step near the parking lot, a spot she took up quite often while she waited for him. She didn't know how much time passed before his headlights cut through the darkness and pulled into a nearby parking spot. Frustrated, she got up and brushed off her sparkly dress. It didn't hold nearly the same charm as it had inside, and Gideon wouldn't even be able to see her flawless makeup or the details in her hair. He got out of the truck to greet her, and he wasn't wearing his costume. He grinned all the same, but Penny's stomach plummeted to the tips of her very pointed shoes.
"Look at you, all dressed up."
He drew her into a hug, but Penny remained stiff. "You aren't dressed up."
"I haven't been home yet," he said. "I was thinking I'd get you first since I was so late. Then we could run by my place where I'd change, and then we'd go."
Penny sighed because they were already late to the party. Way late, and now they had to go across town to his house and back. But what could she do about it? He held the door for her while she climbed into his truck, and they started toward his house.
"You're upset,"
he said. "Yes." No sense in denying it. Her annoyance rode on the air like a scent, and Gideon had always been able to name her moods.
"I was waiting for the approval to come through,"
he said.
"They're in California, and it took longer than anyone expected."
"Things always do," she muttered, looking out her window.
"Penny,"
he said, his voice strong and firm.
"We need to talk about this."
"About what?"
"About what sacrifices we're willing to make for one another."
He exhaled.
"About supporting each other in our dreams and goals. I need to know what you're willing to do for me, and you need to know what I'm willing to do for you. If it's not good enough, we need to be done."
Shock moved through her. First, no one had ever spoken to her like this. Sure, she'd had other men break up with her. Gideon wouldn't be the first, but their reasons were always things like, "You intimidate me," or "I'm not good enough for you," or "You have way more ambition than I want in a woman." It had never been because she needed to be more supportive of her boyfriend. They'd always needed to be more accepting and supportive of her. "What do you mean?"
"I mean, I need to know what you're willing to sacrifice to support me in this career I've chosen. You know what I want, just like I know what you want."
He made a right turn, and she could detect no anger in him at all. Frustration, maybe.
"I bring you lunch while you study with another man. I stand up for you to those jerks who have no vision for the future. I've been nothing but proud of you for how hard you work and what you want to do with your life."
"I know that," she said. "You feel like I'm not doing that for you?"
"You're mad at me constantly."
"You're late constantly," she bit back.
"Yes," he said. "I know. Trust me, Penny. I know how to tell time, and I'm doing the best I can. I haven't canceled on you in 2 months. If I'm a little late, that might be your sacrifice."
"What if I don't want that to be my sacrifice?"
"That's exactly what I need to know,"
he said, stopping at the stop sign. He didn't continue through it.
"Tell me right now, Pen. If you can't do that, if you can't accept that I'm going to be late sometimes, or I might cancel, or that I really don't even want to go to this stupid party, but I'm willing to go because you want to go, then say it. We'll be done, and I'll get out of your hair. You'll be so much happier."
Penny's heart pounded beneath her breastbone. They got along so well most of the time. He'd told her he was falling for her. They'd looked at diamonds months ago, but they'd still gone together. He was willing to end it all because she got upset when he was half an hour late? He eased the truck forward, but he didn't continue straight. He started making a wide turn to go back the way they'd come. "Gideon," she said.
"I think you want me to take you home,"
he said.
"Or to the party? Do you want me to drop you off up there?"
He glanced at her, and Penny felt her world dissolving.
"Do you have someone you can be with? Get a ride home with? I wouldn't feel right dropping you off alone."
"No," she said softly, but she wasn't sure if she was telling him she didn't have anyone to spend time with at the party, or if she wanted him to know she didn't want to break up. Both were true, she supposed.
"Okay, I'll take you home."
"Gideon, I don't want to go home."
"Well, I don't want to go to the party,"
he said. The rest of the drive happened in silence, and Penny had the distinct feeling she'd be a terrible lawyer if she couldn't even talk to her boyfriend in a straight, forthcoming way. He pulled up to her building and parked. He didn't get out to open her door like he'd done countless times before.
"I'm sorry, sweetheart,"
he said.
"I don't want to do this."
"Then don't," she said. He just shook his head, and Penny wished he'd say what he was thinking. Perhaps he already had.
"I'll call you, okay?"
he asked. When he didn't move or say anything else, Penny had no other choice but to open the door and slide from his truck. "Okay." She walked away, flinching when his engine roared as he backed out of the space. At the bottom of the steps, she turned and watched his taillights until they turned and she couldn't see them anymore. Chapter 15. Gideon put in his time at work. His job, something he'd once loved, felt like drudgery. The technology still excited him, and he'd been put on the lead team to discuss microprocessors and personal computers. He'd been talking to a guy who worked for someone named Steve Jobs, and Gideon had started to wonder if he was with the right company. Jobs had big ideas, and that was the kind of person Gideon wanted to be learning from. The top management at IBM was in another state of flux, and Gideon was glad he was still getting paychecks. He hated his classes, but he wasn't going to quit now. He hated that he couldn't call Penny and talk to her about it. He'd said he'd call, but he couldn't just pick up where they'd left off, because he'd asked her what she was willing to sacrifice, and her answer had been clear. She either hadn't thought about it, or she wasn't willing to put up with him being late. Honestly, he was asking a lot of her, especially with the work she put into things. She'd sewn her entire Halloween costume, and in the few seconds of light he'd seen her in, he knew her makeup had taken time, too. A lot of it. He'd told her he hadn't wanted to go to the party, but he'd been willing to go. Was an hour that big of a deal?
"Obviously,"
he said as he scrubbed out the kitchen sink. Only a few days had passed, but to Gideon it felt like years. At the same time, he didn't want to marry Penny only to find out in a year or 2 years or 5 that she was so unhappy. He didn't want to deal with a divorce, especially if they had children. But oh, how he wanted her children. He sighed, the job only half done in the kitchen as he laid down his sponge.
"This is stupid,"
he said.
"Go talk to her."
His mother's words seemed to be on a loop in his head, and they had been since he'd spoken to her weeks ago. It takes work, and forgiveness, and a lot of discussion. Maybe he'd given up too soon. He'd forced Penny to make an executive decision after 2 minutes of conversation. That wasn't a lot of discussion. Gideon washed his hands and checked the clock. 10:30. If Penny stuck to her Saturday schedule, she and Simon had met half an hour ago to study. Gideon knew they had one more test before their final, and that Penny still sat at the top of the chart in the class. Everyone else knew it now, too, and a couple of other boys had asked to join their group. Penny let them all in, and Gideon had tamed his jealousy into a quiet enough beast by taking them lunch and sitting with them for an hour or so before getting on with his life. He'd see Penny on Saturday evenings, and when he kissed her, he never doubted her feelings for him, and only him. He didn't bother showering. He stopped by Dart's for a dozen donuts, not lunch, but it wasn't lunchtime yet, and headed to campus. He'd acted rashly. He needed to have a lot more conversations with Penny before he could simply walk away from her. He parked and headed toward the square. Penny always chose a table near the library, which overlooked the main square in the center of campus. Gideon had taken one step into the square when he found her group. Her auburn hair was a siren's call for him, and the way she talked to a man on her right, and then turned to the other one on her left, showed her powerful personality. She'd be an excellent mother and a phenomenal lawyer. They needed to talk about that, too. She was still 3 years from graduating with her bachelor's degree, 6 from law school. They were young, and Gideon would do whatever she wanted. But if they got married soon, they'd have to delay their family for a long time. Knowing Penny, she'd thought through all of that too, even if they hadn't spoken about it. Simon caught sight of him first, and he touched Penny's forearm and nodded toward Gideon. She looked his direction, and Gideon's pulse shot toward the heavens. He should have prayed before he'd left the house. Everything in his life was off-kilter without her in it. She got up from the table and said something. All 3 men turned and looked toward Gideon, who slowed his steps and paused a healthy distance away. The last thing he wanted to do was have a serious life discussion with her in front of her study buddies. She wore a pair of jeans with the perfect flare at the bottom, a pink blouse and a black jacket over that. She tucked her hands into the jacket as she approached, her eyes flitting around the square like she expected a sneak attack. "What are you doing here?" she asked, finally looking at him. Gideon swept his cowboy hat off his head with his free hand. "I brought donuts for everyone." He extended the dozen toward her, but she wasn't close enough for him to touch her. She took the box and stepped back again. "Is that all?" "No," he said. "I was wondering if you'd be free for dinner tonight." "With you?" "Yes," he said, suddenly feeling very inferior. "With me. I'll pick you up nice and proper, and right on time." Penny met his eyes again, something vulnerable in them. She said nothing. "I miss you, Penny," he said. "I'm sorry I made it a make-or-break moment the other day. We need more discussion. I do think we need to talk about all of this, though, and I want to." She nodded. "I miss you, too." "I'm in love with you," he blurted out. "I hope we can come to a place where we'll both be happy. Not just me and not just you, but both of us." Penny reached up and swiped at her eyes. "You're in love with me?" "Helplessly," he said, half miserable and half hopeful. She sobbed and lunged toward him. He caught her around the waist and held her as tightly as he could. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm so sorry. Please forgive me." "I don't want you to think I'm mad at you all the time," she said, her voice pitchy. "You don't deserve that, and I don't want to be your mother." "I hate disappointing you," he said. "I do, Pen. It's the worst thing in the world for me. I'm trying to figure out how to be the man you deserve, one with a job and a good wage and helpful, too, and the Gideon who wants to invent something the entire world will use." "Let me go talk to my group," she said, "and we'll go right now." She backed up a step. "Really? You don't need to study?" She looked at him, her bright green eyes intense and passionate. "You're more important. I'll be right back." Gideon watched her go, feeling gratitude and relief mixed together inside him. He wasn't sure he deserved a woman like Penny, but he'd been steadily falling for her since the moment his eyes had met hers. He'd never been so grateful his dogs were disobedient, and that Penny had been in that park at that moment, Gideon's faith in a loving God renewed as Penny packed up her books and said goodbye to her friends. When she faced him again, he saw the adoration on her face. She ran the last few steps to him and she dropped her backpack at his feet. "I should have said this a few minutes ago, but I was afraid." Gideon ran his fingers down the side of her face.
We can't be afraid to say things to each other. We get to. Anything we're struggling with. Anything that's bothering us.
Penny nodded along to everything he said. "I love you, Gideon. These last few days have been horrible for me. Watching you drive away from me? I never want to go through that again." Gideon's heart expanded and expanded and expanded.
So we love each other.
"Seems like it." A giant grin spread across her face. "Now what?"
"I went and saw my mother a couple of weeks ago,"
he said, taking her hand. He turned so he was walking the same way as her, and they started to stroll across the square.
"She said we have to talk a lot, discuss what we're willing to sacrifice to support each other. That's why I asked you that the other night."
He hung his head, foolishness racing through him.
"I didn't mean to push you into a place where we weren't talking at all. I was just frustrated. I do not want to fail you, sweetheart. Ever."
"Gideon, that's unreasonable," she said gently. "You're going to fail. I'm going to fail. The important thing is what we do when that happens."
"Can't drive away,"
he muttered.
"I should have called."
"I could have called you too," she said. "I know your number." He looked at her and he saw all the way into her soul. She was kind and good and exactly the right woman for him.
"So I won't drive away again. We'll keep talking, and we'll keep looking toward a future together. When we're ready, I'll buy you the best ring I can afford and we'll get married."
Her smile could have lit the entire country. "And then we'll have those kids." She paused and reached up to touch him, right above where his heart thumped in his chest. "I want to have your children, Gideon."
"As many as the good Lord will give us,"
he said, smiling at her too. He bent down, wishing they'd found a bit more privacy on this campus. He paused, his lips about to touch hers.
"I sure am in love with you, Penny Aarons."
"I sure am in love with you too, Gideon Walker." They laughed together, and then Gideon did kiss her, not caring one whit who saw them. This has been Gideon's Precious Penny, Walker Family Origin Cowboy Romance, Seven Sons Ranch in Three Rivers Romance, Book 8, written by Liz Isaacson. Narrated by Terry Clark Linden, member SAG-AFTRA. Copyright 2020 by Elana Johnson. Production copyright by Elana Johnson.